The Committee on Education and the Workforce will come to order. I note that a quorum is present. Without objection, the chair is authorized to call a recess at any time. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's hearing. Our room this session seems to be plagued by all kinds of problems. Our IT area was flooded, and so that's why we have temporary mics, temporary cameras, and today the air conditioner is not working. So we have some real issues, and I just ask everybody to bear with us on things we have absolutely no control over. One of the most troubling consequences of pandemic-related closures and the left's failing policies, the decline of America's workforce. The Democrats controlled the House for 3 years of the pandemic and its aftermath. They oversaw the greatest spending spree by any nation in world history. When inevitable economic hardship followed, the American people had questions that deserved answers from the Committee on Education and the Workforce. What did the Democrats' oversight look like? In the 116th, 117th Congresses, committee Democrats did not once conduct oversight of their economic shutdowns or the implications for our workforce. Did Democrats hold a hearing on inflation, the single greatest concern for a plurality of Americans? Never. How many times did committee Democrats hold a hearing to address directly the nationwide supply chain disruption? 0 times. In response to the single sharpest spike of unemployment in the 21st century, the Democrat-controlled committee chose to hold hearings in support of closing Main Street small businesses, padding the pockets of big labor union bosses, and advocating for increased federal spending and pandemic giveaways. In fact, Democrats have doubled down on attempts to eliminate opportunities for workers to choose when, where, and how they work. The consequences of this job-killing agenda are preventing small business owners and entrepreneurs from putting more Americans back to work. Instead of making the workforce system more responsive to worker and employer needs, Democrats pushed one-size-fits-all registered apprenticeships while shuttering the industry-recognized apprenticeship program. According to a National Association of Manufacturers survey, more than 62% of manufacturing leaders thought the U.S. economy would officially enter a recession in 2023. In February, the National Federation of Independent Business, NFIB, reported that expectations for better business conditions remain low. I, for one, am not shocked that the American public lost faith in Democrats to handle the economy. You'll hear arguments today from the other side that downplay the seriousness of the challenges we faced and continue to face. Charitably put, they are inaccurate. To dispel just a few, while the unemployment figure is low, it doesn't paint a full picture. Millions exited the workforce during the pandemic. The economy has not recovered, and the workforce participation still lags behind pre-pandemic rates. All the while, too many businesses are struggling to fill the nearly 11 million open positions. NFIB reported that inflation is the single most important problem facing its members. In June, inflation reached 9.1%, the highest level since December 1981. More recently, the inflation rate has slowed and is now closer to the conditions experienced in the summer of 1982 and the winter of 1990, but these times are better known for their economic downturns. In short, Democrats have created conditions for future unemployment through massive spending and increased regulations. Forcefully increasing union participation will not give this country a stronger workforce. Washington should not be in the business of picking winners and losers in our economy, whether it be through overturning every right-to-work law in the country, eliminating independent contracting, jeopardizing franchise businesses, or rewarding union bosses with unchecked power by acquiescing to every item on their wish list. House Republicans were given a mandate by the American people to offer an alternative vision for our economy. We'll put forward solutions to reduce unnecessary regulations, control spending, offer more Americans opportunities for skills development, and remove impediments to hiring. Skills-based education is one pathway to prepare students for the job market. By increasing work-based learning opportunities and extending the Pell Grant to short-term, high-quality programs, we can help workers get the skills they need for lifelong success. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. With that, I yield to Ranking Member Scott for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Fox, and good morning. I thought it'd be helpful to show a chart of the economy that was just described as disparaged, but this chart behind me shows the average number of jobs per month in the last 5 presidential administrations. And we can see the Biden administration, 495,000 jobs, significantly higher than any administration in the last 30 years, certainly better than the 2 Republican administrations in the last 30 years, but that's the economy that was just described. When President Biden took office, he inherited an economy that was thrown into disarray by the previous administration's mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, thanks to the investments made in the Biden-Harris administration and congressional Democrats, the economy has grown from the bottom up and the middle out. Almost 3 years ago, in April 2020, our nation's unemployment rate was over 14%. In January 2021, at the beginning of President Biden's term, the unemployment rate had fallen to 6.2%, and according to the most recent job reports, the unemployment rate is now approximately 3.6%, one of the lowest in modern history. Additionally, the first 2 years of the Biden administration were, respectively, the first and second largest job growth years in American history. The economy under President Biden has added more than 12 million jobs. Economists had predicted that the jobs destroyed during the Trump administration would not be recovered until the summer of 2026. Instead, the economy bounced back to pre-pandemic levels by June of 2022, 4 years earlier than expected. Finally, President Biden's economic policies have led to a historic boom for small businesses. In fact, his first 2 years in office have been 2 of the greatest years for small business applications on record. This recovery did not happen by accident. It is directly connected to the leadership of President Biden and congressional Democrats. Through several COVID-19 relief packages, Congress delivered support to help workers and their families pay their bills, stay safely on the job, and access health care. Through the American Rescue Plan, which we will remember passed without a single Republican vote, House or Senate, congressional Democrats saved more than 1 million retirees' hard-earned pensions. Had we not acted, these pensions would have failed. Workers and retirees, from truckers to bricklayers, would lose nearly everything they'd worked to save, and tens of thousands of participating employers may have been forced to close or cut jobs. And the federal government would have ended up paying more to have the pensions fail because of safety net expenses than we spent saving the pensions. While price increases caused by supply chain disruptions and global inflation forced many working families to stretch their dollar further, record wage increases over the past 3 years have helped make up for these increased costs and buffered families from price shocks. Simply put, even in the face of rising interest rates, Americans are back to work and businesses are thriving thanks to the Biden-Harris administration's economic agenda. President Biden has done all of this while delivering on his commitment to fiscal responsibility. In fact, President Biden cut the deficit by more than $1.7 trillion during his first 2 years in office. Fiscal year 2022 decline in federal deficit was the largest one-year decline in American history. And while with President Biden's track record, it is no surprise that a recent Navigator poll shows that more Americans trust President Biden in congressional Democrats in handling job growth in the economy than their colleagues. So when we invest in students, workers, and families, and when we invest in students, workers, and families, America succeeds. At a minimum, we shouldn't go backwards and return to the failed Republican policies that mishandled the COVID-19 pandemic, prioritized regressive tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, and unleashed harmful deregulation. Unfortunately, during the House Republicans' first few months in the majority, they prioritized divisive legislation that does nothing to help Americans get ahead. They also continue to use our nation's full faith and credit as a bargaining chip to force devastating cuts in Social Security and Medicare and key Department of Labor priorities that protect our nation's workers. By threatening to default on our nation's debt, congressional Republicans are gambling with our fragile economic recovery in order to force through an unpopular and dangerous agenda. Furthermore, congressional Democrats remain focused on solutions to help every American succeed in the modern economy. That's why I reintroduced the bipartisan, bicameral Protecting the Right to Organize, or the PRO Act, alongside 200 members of the House and Senate. Unions are essential for building a strong middle class and improving the lives of our workers and families. The PRO Act will ensure that every worker can reap benefits of a union, which means bigger paychecks, better benefits, and safer workplaces. I'm also committed to improving our workforce development programs by reauthorizing the National Apprenticeship Act and the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and expanding the Pell Grant program for short-term programs, which I believe we have good bipartisan support on that legislation, as well as legislation which is bicameral and bipartisan called the Transformation to Competitive Integrated Employment Act, because strong labor standards open a pathway to opportunity for all workers, but only if those standards actually apply to all workers. Taken together, these priorities will help prepare workers for the modern economy and ensure employers have access to qualified candidates. So I'm hopeful that all of our colleagues will join us in rejecting failed policies of the past and putting people over politics and delivering solutions that actually help workers and employers succeed. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member for his comments. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, all members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m., 14 days after the date of this hearing, which is April 11, 2023. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I now turn to the introduction of our distinguished witnesses. Mr. Chris Spear is President and CEO of the American Trucking Association, ATA. Mr. Spear has worked in the transportation, energy, labor, and technology sectors, and he previously served as Assistant Secretary of Labor for Policy and as professional staff in the U.S. Senate. Mr. Jerry Akers is a small business owner and franchisee from Palo, Iowa. With his wife and 2 daughters, he operates 39 franchise locations in Iowa and Nebraska and employs 220 workers. Mr. Akers is testifying on behalf of the International Franchise Association. Dr. Heidi Shierholtz is president of the Economic Policy Institute, EPI. Dr. Shierholtz served as the chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor during the Obama administration. Mr. Stephen Moore is a distinguished fellow in economics at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Moore focuses on advancing public policies that increase the rate of economic growth. He works on budget, fiscal, and monetary policy. We thank all the witnesses for being here today and look forward to your testimony. I'd like to remind the witnesses that we've read your written statements and they will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8D and committee practice, I ask that you each limit your oral presentations to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. I also like to remind the witnesses to be aware of their responsibility to provide accurate information to the subcommittees. Before you begin your testimony, please remember to press the button on the microphones in front of you so it'll turn on, the members can hear you. And I'll ask you to hold those mics fairly close. As I said, we're dealing with temporary things here and trying to make do. So we want to be able to hear what you have to say. As you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow to signal that you have 1 minute remaining. When the light turns red, your 5 minutes have expired, and we ask that you please wrap up. Also, as long-standing committee practice, we'll let the entire panel make their presentations before we move to member questions. When answering a question, please remember once again to turn your microphone on and then off once finished. I first recognize Mr. Spear for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the ATA. For 90 years, the ATA has represented an industry that today employs nearly 8 million of the hardest working men and women in America. That's 1 in 18 jobs, where 1 of the top 5 jobs in 29 states is trucking related. Their husbands, their wives, their moms, their dads, their family members, and they're behind the wheel of every truck you see today. Throughout COVID, the global pandemic, our drivers continued to climb into their cabs, delivering not only milk, eggs, toilet paper, and fuel, but PPE, test kits, and life-saving medications, including the vaccine itself. Our workforce shouldered this responsibility with the fortitude that being essential demands. And America was grateful, with billboards in cornfields to banners hanging off overpasses, all thanking a trucker. Our members, large, medium, and small businesses, have presence in every state and congressional district in the country. More than 80% of U.S. communities rely exclusively on trucking to meet their daily needs. Trucks now move more than 70% of our country's domestic freight, as well as 73% of USMCA freight, making trade and trucking synonymous. Over the next decade, trucks will be tasked with moving 2.4 billion more tons of freight than they do today. For that to happen, we must continue to put safety and our workforce first. Today, the trucking industry invests more than $10 billion annually in safety, education, and employee development. And as innovation continues to shape our industry, the experience needed to operate and service our equipment will further benefit our workforce, both in terms of skill and competition. This is a good story, one we at ATA like sharing. Our workforce is committed to making a difference. To that end, our written testimony submits 4 recommendations for your consideration. First, we need to shore up the growing shortage of talent, most notably 78,000 drivers and 41,000 technicians. Drivers on average earn nearly $70,000 plus full benefits without a college degree and all the debt that comes with it. That's up 19% over the last 5 years, higher than any other mode. We've launched initiatives to hire more veterans and exiting military personnel, more minorities, especially from urban communities with higher unemployment, and more women. A goal made possible by IIJA monies being used for new, safe, and secure truck parking. And we're capitalizing on IIJA education, development, and technology for 18 to 20-year-olds to cross state lines, far exceeding all existing state requirements. Second, we need to end the unfounded assault on the 9-decade-old independent contractor model, jeopardizing not only the jobs and lives of 350,000 truck drivers throughout the country, but the millions of other American workers who willingly choose this professional path. Third, we need to untangle federal and state regulations. from licensing and credentialing to state legalization of recreational marijuana and combating opioid abuse. And lastly, we need to double down on our workforce development. It's what gives every employee job security and growth opportunities. A post-COVID WIOA makeover would ensure our industry is defined as essential, skilled, and in demand, and that local workforce boards resource trucking accordingly. What gets us from here to there unites us all, not only elevating our economy, but every employee involved. Addressing these 4 recommendations would allow our workforce to safely and responsibly meet consumer and economic demands over the next decade. Do that, and you'll make a difference too. I thank you in advance for your consideration, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Akers, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Jerry Akers, and I own and operate with my wife and 2 daughters 39 Great Clips salons and 5 The Joint chiropractic clinics in my home state of Iowa, as well as Nebraska. I appreciate the invitation to appear on behalf of the International Franchise Association to share my story of small business ownership and share the value proposition of the franchise business format. It is a particular privilege to testify at this time of year, as Great Clips is the official hair care provider of March Madness. One of the many benefits of signing with a franchise brand. After all, if I opened my own salons, there's no way that I could afford to do March Madness for advertising. I have experienced firsthand the impact of the remarkable franchise model and what it does to change the lives of aspiring entrepreneurs, employees, and local economies. Originally from Iowa, I grew up on a farm. Today, my wife and I have established an enterprise that now employs 220 team members. And as an area developer for the Joint Chiropractic, I also assist fellow franchisees to generate sustained success for their entrepreneurial journey. Our business is impacting 4 generations of my family and up to 3 generations of employees' families as we speak. Franchising democratizes business ownership, perhaps more than any other business model in America. Around 26% of franchises are owned by people of color, compared with 17% of independent businesses. Further, black-owned franchise firms generate an average of 2.2 times more in sales compared to black-owned non-franchise businesses. The COVID-19 pandemic battered all small businesses in historic ways and caused us to permanently shut down 5 of our Great Clips salons. Our employees are literally a part of our family, and we had to furlough them because we had no revenue coming in to take care of them. During the early days of COVID, we held daily check-in calls with our entire staff across 2 states, with constant updates as to their potential return to work. We provided health insurance to those who had health insurance with us every day of the pandemic, despite our business being threatened. Being part of a franchise system helped us navigate the pandemic. In franchising, we say you go into business for yourself, but not by yourself. My fellow franchisees regularly shared best practices and brainstorm ideas on how to reopen and operate. Our systems helped us access programs like the EIDL and ERTC, as well as the PPP loans. Each week, our brand hosted weekly webinars to assist with operations, including how to find personal protection equipment and the most current salon guidelines by recommendations of the CDC. Our brands also cut down on franchise fees, so we were able to focus more on the health precautions and safety for our employees and customers. The economic uncertainty initiated by COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the many benefits of the franchise business model. According to a recent survey, 50% of franchisees said they were better able to navigate inflationary pressures and other pandemic area business challenges thanks to the support of their franchising network. While we are on a path to recovery from the devastating effects of the pandemic, we still have a long way to go. According to an IFA survey released earlier this month, the availability of workers remains the most important problem facing franchise businesses today. We want to hire 70 more staff members, but despite the fact we offer top wages and exceptional benefits in comparison to other businesses in our area, we cannot. We also offer our employees an opportunity to pursue education at cosmetology schools, but Iowa is a challenging state. The industry faces some of the most onerous occupational licensing requirements of any business model. The unnecessary requirements to work in hair salons leave significant economic development on the table in many states. Despite all of these economic headwinds, if policymakers do no harm, franchise businesses in all business lines will surely accelerate the post-COVID economic recovery. But there is no more significant and avoidable threat to small businesses than the PRO Act. As a hotel owner testified before the Senate in 2021, the PRO Act is perhaps the single most anti-small business bill ever introduced in Congress. That's because as soon as legislation is signed into law, the PRO Act's joint employer and independent contractor provisions would combine to legislate away the ability to operate a franchise as a small business owner. There must be a better way to protect workers' rights that doesn't come at the expense of small businesses. In the face of the PRO Act and the National Labor Relations Board's forthcoming joint employer rule, small business owners need legislation called the Save Local Business Act. This is the single most important federal legislation for the 800,000 franchise businesses nationwide, as it would certainly provide guidance for misguided regulators who will legislate away the future of the business model. In conclusion, franchise businesses possess the unique ability to address the workforce challenges faced by our nation. Franchise businesses also offer unparalleled opportunities for people of color, women, and veteran entrepreneurs, promoting a more inclusive and diverse business landscape. Thank you again, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Akers. Dr. Shierholtz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. My name is Heidi Shierholtz. I am an economist and president of the Economic Policy Institute. To talk about the state of the economy today, I want to start by backing up to the end of 2020, the end of the Trump administration, 3/4 of a year after the start of COVID. So this is after the initial rush of millions of jobs coming back as businesses that had been locked down were coming back online. By late 2020, the recovery was faltering. We actually lost jobs in December 2020, and we still had a gap in the labor market of 10 million jobs. At a similar point in the recovery from the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009, Congress chose austerity, starving the economy of aggregate demand, a dynamic that Republicans in Congress maintained until 2017. The result was an incredibly weak and slow recovery. It took a decade after that recession to get back down to the pre-recession unemployment rate. This time, however, Congress and President Biden chose a dramatically different path when the recovery was faltering. Additional fiscal support was passed in December 2020, and substantially more was passed in March of 2021 with the American Rescue Plan, and the payoff to those choices has been mind-boggling. We added 12.4 million jobs in the last 25 months. 2021 and 2022 saw the single largest job growth of any two-year period in U.S. history. In the past year, the unemployment rate has gotten down to 50-year lows, and the prime-age labor force participation rate is now back up to where it was before COVID hit. Further, inflation-adjusted wage growth for low-wage workers was far faster over the last 3 years than at the same point in the recovery from any recession of the last 50 years. These are huge policy accomplishments. Talk about unleashing employment. One question, however, that often arises is whether our COVID relief and recovery measures, while clearly generating an incredibly fast jobs recovery, also perhaps caused the high inflation of the last 2 years, which has been a major challenge for American families. The answer to that is a resounding no. The acceleration of inflation was overwhelmingly the result of mammoth shocks to the economy by the pandemic, which caused both a dramatic shift in a dramatic increase in the demand demand for goods as people shifted spending away from face-to-face services and toward goods, and huge snarls in precisely those global supply chains that need to function smoothly in order to meet the demand for goods. And then on top of that, the Russian invasion of Ukraine spiked energy and food prices. And Those shocks set off substantial ripple effects throughout the economy. So employers had to raise wages to get and keep the workers that they needed, which is a very good thing. And firms also raised prices opportunistically to boost their profits. In this recovery, rising profits account for 40% of the increase in inflation, whereas in normal times, profits account for about a third that much. Basically, without the strong jobs recovery and the critical expansions of the safety net created by our relief and recovery measures, the burst of inflation still would have happened, but would have been much more damaging to working families. Imagine if we had faced that burst of inflation, but with millions more people out of work and lower nominal wage growth for those with jobs. It is worth noting that as the labor market normalizes, job growth will slow to more normal levels. Nominal wage growth is already back down to basically where it was pre-recession, but we can lock in some of the gains that workers have experienced through tighter labor markets by enacting policies like raising the minimum wage, expanding overtime and joint employer protections, strengthening unions, holding employers accountable for labor violations like misclassification and wage theft. The PRO Act is a crucial reform. The independent contractor rule being finalized at DOL will provide much needed clarity and reduce misclassification. And then the final thing I want to say is that stronger labor standards and unions will not only make our economy fairer, they will make our economy stronger. Neoliberal policies and deregulation of the last 40 years resulted in rising inequality over that period and much slower overall growth. Spending falls as inequality increases because income is shifted away from low and middle income workers, who are the ones who have to spend most of what they get on necessities, and towards higher income workers who have the luxury to save. Inequality slows growth. Policies that help ensure that our economy works for everyone are the very policies that will make our economy stronger, more resilient, and faster growing. Thank you. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And now, Stephen Moore is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. It is a great honor to be here. The big question for the American economy right now is, where are the American workers? Where are the workers? If you ask any small businessman or woman, I bet every one of you in your districts are facing the same issue. Businesses are saying they're having a very difficult time getting workers back on the job. Heidi is right that it's a strong jobs market right now. The big problem is finding the workers to fill those jobs. Why are Americans not in the workforce at the rate that they have traditionally been? I would make two arguments. Number one, real wages have declined very sharply in the last 2 years. And this is, of course, a result of the massive increase in inflation that hit 9.2%. So just to put this in perspective, the average worker in America since Biden came into office has lost somewhere in the neighborhood of $3,500 to $4,000 in annual income. That means work isn't paying, because even though wages are up nominally, as Heidi was saying, in real terms, people's purchasing powers have gotten killed. And that's the reason you're seeing so much economic pessimism around the country. People are feeling it every day. The other problem is we're paying too much for people not to work. And I hope that this committee will address that as one of the #1 problems in the country. In other words, we are not making work pay, we're making not working pay with the welfare benefits that have been provided. So quickly, one of the big mistakes that we made during COVID that accelerated the collapse in jobs. Obviously, shutting down the economy as we did, especially in blue states, turned out to be one of the greatest catastrophes, I think, in American history economically. It didn't have health benefits, but it sure did destroy small businesses and jobs for workers. What's happened since, if you look at my testimony, if you look at this figure on page 3, if you have it in front of you, and this has been persistent for the last 30 months. The blue states that locked down their economies have had persistently higher unemployment than the red states that remained open. It's also true that these blue states like New York and Connecticut and California provide much, much higher benefits to people for not working than red states do, and that's caused the unemployment rate problem to be worse. It's frustrating to me because, you know, when you look at 2020, the beginning of 2020, the United States had probably the best, in many ways, the best economy ever in the history of this country. We had the lowest unemployment rate for every group, for blacks, Hispanics, Asians, single mothers. We had the lowest poverty rate for blacks, Hispanics, every demographic group. And of course, we had very rapid rises in income. And subsequently, that has reversed. And so you've seen these declines in income that are making work not pay. Now, a couple of other things that I'd like to point out quickly. One is we have to do welfare reform. We have to get back to the reforms that we put in place in 1996 under a Democratic President, Bill Clinton, and a Republican Congress that was headed by Newt Gingrich as the Speaker of the House. One of the most successful programs in the last 50 years in terms of social policy changes was that bipartisan welfare reform. And at the heart of that reform was two things. One, time limits on how long people could get welfare. We're not saying get rid of the social net. We're a wealthy country. Absolutely should have a safety net for people. But it should not be a way of life. It should be a temporary assistance program. So we time limited these programs. And the other thing that is absolutely critical, every single welfare payment program that you administer at the federal level, every program should require work or training. It was a huge success, and the benefits of welfare reform exceeded anybody's expectations. If you look at what happened after 1996, we saw the most dramatic decline in welfare, in people on welfare in the history of the welfare state. After welfare reform happened, what happened to those people? They got into the workforce. What happened to them when they got in the workforce? Their earnings rose. It was a tremendous success. The child poverty rate after welfare reform was lower than it had ever been since the 1960s. So huge, huge benefits across the board from welfare reform, not just for the overall economy, but the people who are on welfare, because there is dignity in work, and there is a lot of economic success on that. Three quick recommendations other than welfare reform, just for you all to think about. Number one, we need more legal immigrants in this country. We should be increasing our legal immigrant numbers very significantly. These are people who will enter the workforce. Immigrants have very high labor force participation rates. Our immigration levels I'm talking about legal. We need to increase that. Number two, something to think about. You know, there's an old saying that the age 70 is the new 50. If you look at the Social Security program, there's a flaw in that program. Benefits for people who continue to work after 70 are not actuarially, so people are being punished in terms of working after the age of 70. We have to correct that. So if somebody works to the age of 75 or 78, their benefits for their lifetime should be adjusted so that they're not reduced. Because you know what? We're an aging population. We need older people to be working. And by the way, people who work longer when they're old have higher life expectancies. And then finally, don't overtax investment. I know just one quick point. The Biden tax plan, if you were to put that calamity into effect, the tax rate on an investment would go to 80%. Who is going to invest in a small business at an 80% tax rate? Okay, thank you. You hear her?
Sorry. Under Committee Rule 9, we'll now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. I'll wait to ask my questions and therefore recognize Mr. Wahlberg from Michigan for 5 minutes.
I thank the Madam Chairwoman, and thanks for the panel for being here today. I would say to Mr. Moore that welfare reform, I'm over here.
Oh, you're sorry, I couldn't see you.
Welfare reform began in Michigan under Engler.
It did.
As an example, and it worked. Sadly, it's gone today.
I believe John Engler was the governor at that time.
Yes, I would like to discuss workforce challenges. Unfortunately, Michigan recently repealed its right-to-work law, the first state to do that in more than half a century to take such action. In a recent town hall, I spoke with an independent electrical contractor who expressed her concern over this misguided approach, which will increase cost and limit opportunity. Unfortunately, some here in Washington have proposed legislation that would nullify right-to-work laws in states all across the country. Mr. Speer, can you please expand a bit on how trucking industry uses the independent contractor business model and why it's worked so well for your members and the workers who willingly choose this professional path? And then secondly, could you please describe the impact legislation like the PRO Act would have on independent contractors in the trucking industry?
Absolutely, Congressman. I think the key word that you use with regards to independent contractors is choice. Choice. They choose that path for whatever reason. It could be seasonal work, got another business on the side, whatever the reason may be, that's their decision. And I think legislation, starting with the PRO Act to the NLRA, we're seeing AB 5 in California remove that choice. And this is a 90-year-old supported business model in case law. And we want to remove that choice. Why? Because I think union rates have been cut in half since 1983. We were at 20.1 public and private unions. We're down to 10.1% of the workforce, public and private unions today. And they want to bolster membership. They want to bolster dues. But you don't change the law to channel more people into unions. You want to belong to a union? Belong to a union.
Right.
But you should also have the right not to belong to a union. And those laws have been in existence since 1935. So, I look at this assault on a 90-year-old business model like independent contractors. It would be ridiculously impactful on our industry. We're already short 78,000 drivers. This is 350,000 independent contractors that chose that path. No one's forcing them to do it. They chose it. Talk to them. Go out and talk to the actual independent contractors and ask them, is anybody forcing you to be in this category so the employer can avoid paying you more or avoid benefits? The answer is resounding no. And for any abuse, we have laws in place for over 9 decades to deal with that. The PRO Act would remove, beyond the independent contractor legislation and regulations, the PRO Act would be an all-out assault, not just on independent contractors, but on states' right-to-work laws. Your state just revoked it. That's their decision. I don't agree with that. Any state has the right to put that in place. The PRO Act would eliminate half of the states in this country that have right-to-work laws on the books.
And it's not, as we found in Michigan, it wasn't the workers or the independent contractors asking for the right-to-work law to be taken out. It was the union bosses, and the legislature gave in there. Thanks. Let me move on. Changing gears, franchises support nearly 8.5 million direct jobs in the U.S. economy. In Michigan alone, franchises support over 235,000 employees. Mr. Akers, can you tell us about the FTC franchise rule and how it would continue to foster small business creation in the franchise space?
Yes. Unfortunately, what those types of rules do is they turn me into a general manager as opposed to being an entrepreneur. They put so much impact back on the corporate group. So everybody ends up working for a large corporation rather than an independent person like myself, an entrepreneur. This takes away everything that I've worked my life for to try and build. And by the way, as with many things that come out of these kinds of regulations, we take better care of our employees than most of the rules end up putting in place anyhow right now today. We don't need all of those kinds of things. So what that does is usurp the franchise model, which is one of the largest drivers of small business and the economy in the country today, and puts us in a situation where we become employees instead of entrepreneurs. Thank you for your question.
My time has expired. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wahlberg. I now recognize Mr. Ticano from California for 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, we're having trouble with the as you know, the technology here. Great. It is abundantly clear that the Biden administration inherited an economy in dire straits as Republicans vocalize falsehoods about what has put the American economy back on track. The policies Democrats pursued speak for themselves, even despite the unique challenges global inflation has presented. As we discuss policies Democrats can pursue to help, it is imperative that we look at ways in which we can still improve. The Fair Labor Standards Act established an overtime compensation requirements for certain employees when they worked more than 40 hours, and the Labor Secretary has the authority to create the parameters relating to the white-collar exemption, meaning that certain professional employees are not eligible. This week, I will be introducing the Restoring Our Overtime Pay Act with Representative Adams and Senator Brown. The bill seeks to codify an enhanced overtime salary threshold at a historic high of the 55th percentile of earnings of full-time salaried workers nationwide. This threshold would be at least $82,732 by 2026. Overtime standards are long overdue for a meaningful update, and it is high time our country pursued powerful protections for workers, especially in the wake of COVID-19. So, Dr. Shierholtz, would you agree that the current overtime standards are overdue to be updated?
Yes, I would. And I thank you for that question, and I'm really happy to answer it. But I want to take 1 second to just correct something that was stated earlier. The PRO Act would not destroy the independent contractor model. Anyone who is a bona fide independent contractor would not be affected. Those who are misclassified as independent contractors, the thing that they would be able to do is those who would be impacted are those who are misclassified who want to be able to organize. That's what it does. It's not a wholesale redo. Okay, sorry for that diversion. So yes, we absolutely need to increase the overtime threshold. Right now, the overtime threshold is at $35,568 a year. So basically, anyone who makes over $36,000 can be asked to work 60, 70 hours without getting any additional pay. It's really like the idea that somebody who makes $36,000 a year has enough bargaining power with respect to their employer that they don't need the protections to keep them from being exploited from overwork is absolutely, it's just, I think everyone in this room would agree that that's not the case.
Yeah, it's my recollection that in the 70s, the overtime pay threshold was at a level that included 70% of the salaried workforce. Is that right?
Yeah, it was, our calculations put it at just like 63% of the full-time salaried workers earned below the threshold. In other words, it was high enough that it covered nearly 2/3 of full-time salary workers. Now,
so it's 2/3,
yes,
not 70%.
You got it.
But what is that percentage now of salaried workers today?
I think, okay, I can make sure to check this for you for the record, but I think it's around 15%. It's a huge drop.
We go from nearly 2/3 of the American workforce being covered by overtime pay. They were eligible for overtime pay. In fact, they had a right to it, but that right has diminished from the 70s of 2/3 to 15%.
Yep.
That's an incredible figure. You know, from 1938, I understand that a trucker who's paid $38,000 a day, which is lower, I mean, I admit trucking salaries have gone up, but they would not be able to earn overtime pay. Is that correct?
If they are,
they're exempt.
They're exempt. They're really open to misclassification. So you're supposed to still get overtime protections if you earn $38,000. If you are, if you are not like a bona fide manager or sort of highly paid professional. But there's a ton of misclassification. They're extremely vulnerable to being exploited by overwork.
So if a trucker goes on an interstate highway, they're exempt from overtime pay protections. Is that right?
They likely wouldn't pass the duties test, you're supposed to be a bona fide manager where you get overtime even if you are paid over the threshold, but that is violated all the time, which is one of the reasons we really need to raise the threshold in order to make sure that people have the protections.
Well, I think with the shortage of truckers in this country, I'm all for the training and improving that industry, but I think it's high time that we stop exempting truckers from the FLSA. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. Mr. Grothman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Come on. Okay, thank you. Couple questions. Some we've kind of already gone over, but with regard to the trucking industry, do you think we'd have more truckers if we would allow people to get a CDL at age and drive interstate at a CDL at age 20 instead of 21?
You're asking me,
Yeah.
Congressman? Yes. Listen, I think you got to do a lot of things to shore up the shortage. You're looking at 78,000 currently, 160,000 over the next 8 years. If this trend continues, so to maintain current economic demand, we need to add more talent behind the wheel. 18 to 20 is one of those solutions. You need to train them to safely and responsibly operate the equipment. Now, 48 states currently allow an 18-year-old to drive a Class 8. You just can't cross state lines.
What in the world would be the possible reason, if that many states allow you to drive back and forth in your state, to bar you from crossing state lines?
It's the difference between state and federal jurisdiction. We're saying that let's train them. Let's give them
So
the
in
skill
other words,
set.
we're saying that 48 state legislatures are incompetent, apparently. Is that what we're saying?
No, I think that's their jurisdiction. You just can't cross state lines. We cross state lines every day. So to train somebody, to teach somebody how to operate this equipment, doesn't matter if you're running from Sacramento down to San Diego,
Thanks.
but you should be able to cross.
Yeah, we're trying to help you.
Yep.
We can say that 48 state legislators are competent, and it's the U.S. Congress that's incompetent. We can say that.
Well, we put 18 to 20 as a pilot in the IIJA. We supported that.
Okay. Now, we don't have somebody up here who represents an airline, but I know a guy who does the annual inspections for airline pilots to make sure they can keep flying up to age 65. He doesn't know why that shouldn't be 67 or 68. Mr. Moore, would it do something to solve the pilot shortage if we allowed pilots to keep being pilots, commercial pilots, to 67 or 68, provided somebody signs off?
I think we just, look, I don't know the specific situation with pilots, but we need to have a cultural shift in America where Americans are rewarded for working more years. We're healthier than ever before.
Okay.
We have longer life expectancies. And as I mentioned, please address that issue with Social Security, because it's just not fair to people who work past the age of 70.
Well, okay, Mr. Akers, there are a variety of programs that are phased out as people make more money. Earned income tax credit starts going up, but I think it's obviously biggest impact on society is to discourage people from making very much money, because if you begin to make more money, you'll lose the earned income tax credit. Low-income housing, food stamps, Medicaid, Pell Grants is another program that discourages people from working, or you're no longer considered poor. Do you see in your employees either people not working because of the generosity of these programs, or more likely want to stop working when they make, say, $15,000 to $20,000 so they aren't phased out?
Absolutely, and this has been going on for a long time. Literally, I'll have stylists that have discussions with me, and they tell me they don't want to work full-time hours. They can only work 19 hours because that's the threshold where they lose some of the benefits.
Exactly. All over the place. All of these programs, earned income tax credit, low-income housing, food stamps, Medicaid, Pell Grants, are designed by somebody who wanted to discourage people from working. And I'll point out, all those programs are also designed by somebody who wants to discourage marriage. Another program for you in general, because I'm sure you have tons of resumes across your desk. Do people with psychology or communication arts, political science degrees, even a master's degree in business, do you view that as a positive when you're hiring somebody, or is it just largely irrelevance?
It's largely irrelevant. I'm looking for skills and talents and the ability to get along with people primarily. We'll train them on the rest of it.
Okay, I heard one employer say that he didn't like to hire people with master's degrees because by then they'd spent so long in college they had to be deprogrammed. Do you know anybody else in your profession?
They don't know how to work anymore because they've been in school for their whole life.
My goodness, you're what one of my friends said. In other words, you feel in some cases a master's degree is not only a non-existent qualification, but almost a minus. Is that true?
Yes, I do. I'm sure it's great in their area of expertise if they can get a job in that area, but if they're trying to get a job anywhere else in another field, it's a detriment.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Grossman. Ms. Jayapal, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Under Democratic leadership, the American economy rebounded from the pandemic, achieving record low unemployment and healthy productivity. And though we still face economic challenges, the answer is not austerity and reckless deregulation, but rather we've seen so much progress from investing in our future and strengthening worker protections to build an economy that works for everyone. In January, the Federal Trade Commission made a historic stride toward this goal, announcing its plan to ban the use of non-compete clauses, contract terms that prohibit employees from later working for or starting a competing business. Non-competes, which cover nearly 1 in 5 workers, prevent workers from accepting a higher-paying job in their chosen profession or pursuing their own dream of starting their own company. By banning this coercive practice, the FTC's proposed rule will promote worker freedom, invigorate the labor market, and stimulate broad economic growth. And the title of this hearing is Unleashing America's Opportunities for Hiring and Employment. So I want to just examine how non-competes unleash opportunities. So Dr. Shierholtz, do non-competes generally restrict or expand employment opportunities for workers?
They absolutely restrict employment opportunities. You literally cannot take a job in your field for a certain period of time when you have had to sign a non-compete.
And those who defend the use of non-competes give examples of top management executives who may have sensitive information about their employer. Is this representative of all the workers who are bound by non-competes?
No, it is not. There are a lot of workers who, there's just no way they have access to trade secrets who are also bound by non-compete. So for example, EPI did a study that showed that looked at this, that showed that a quarter of workplaces where the typical employee education level is a high school degree, everyone in that company is covered by a non-compete agreement.
So security guards, phlebotomists, factory employees, many of the occupations that are subject to non-competes. In fact, 10% of food service workers are bound by non-competes as well. So the FTC's proposed rule will empower roughly 30 million workers to take new jobs that were previously off limits to them, unleashing new opportunities for workers. Dr. Shierholtz, do you expect this rule to increase or decrease wages?
The rule will absolutely increase wages for workers. So one of the key ways, a non-unionized worker, essentially the only source of power they have with respect to their employer is the fact that they could quit and take another job. Non-compete agreements cut that off. So it totally suppresses wage growth for those workers. And the empirical evidence is really clear on this. Banning non-competes would increase wages.
And let's talk about employers for a second. Do non-competes generally restrict or expand hiring pools for employers?
Yeah, when an employer wants to hire a worker in a certain field, the key pool of workers that they could look at are workers who are working in that field. Non-competes just make many of that, that pool much, much smaller.
So it's good for employers as well.
Right.
What about new startups and small businesses? Would the proposed FTC rule restrict or support or hinder the creation of new startups and small businesses?
The empirical evidence is really clear. Banning non-competes would increase business formation. It's because non-competes mean that you can't start a business in that field. So it inhibits innovation. It means, like if I have an idea of how to do something better, I actually can't go do that because I've signed a non-compete agreement.
So good for workers, good for employers, good for wages. Let's talk about the argument that non-competes are necessary to safeguard trade secrets and other sensitive information, but there's actually several laws on the books already protecting firms, like intellectual property laws, the Uniform Trade Secrets Act, and the Economic Espionage Act. Are non-competes essential to protecting a firm's trade secrets?
They totally are not, and we can look at states that have made non-competes unenforceable, including California, to say, which includes Silicon Valley, to say, are we really seeing this massive decrease in innovation because employers are getting their trade secrets stolen? That is just not the case. Employers can use these other intellectual property laws, and also one thing that they can do is still do tailored non-disclosure agreements, even without doing non-compete agreements that can also protect trade secrets.
This is really a bipartisan issue. 3 states, California, Oklahoma, and North Dakota, have all voided non-competes, and 5 more, including my home state of Washington, have significantly restricted them. And guess what? The sky didn't fall. This is an important rule that will help workers, help small businesses, and help employers. Thank you so much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Allen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I was a small business owner for over 40 years. Obviously, small business is the backbone of this economy. In fact, in the best economy in my generation, which Mr. Moore mentioned, 70% of all new jobs created were small business, and small business created over, was working about 50% of the workforce at that time. The Biden Department of Labor's, and let's talk about the PRO Act and just clear this up a little bit. The Biden Department of Labor proposed independent contractor classification rule that would significantly muddy the waters on the standards used to determine independent contractor status, and would significantly undermine the independent contractor model, if not destroy it entirely. This attack on independent contractors by a Democratic administration is nothing new. We had the same challenge under the last term of the Obama administration when I was first elected to Congress. During the COVID pandemic, we saw that 60+ million Americans wanted more flexibility, and their livelihoods depended on the flexibilities that being an independent contractor provides. My Employee Rights Act, which I have co-authored with Tim Scott in the last Congress, would codify the common law definition of an employee, allowing independent contractors to keep the flexibility that they currently enjoy. Mr. Akers, under this Labor Department rule, how would that impact your overall business operations?
Excuse me. Would dramatically impact it. We lose total control over our employees. They're driven by other guidance outside of our sphere of influence. So this takes away the opportunity for me as an entrepreneur to change the lives of my employees, to give them a better existence, change the lives for their children, because one size fits all doesn't work nationwide. The economic situation in Iowa completely different than other states.
Well, obviously, bottom up is better than top down. That's the way America runs, is bottom up, and we are a grassroots country. And thank you, sir, for what you're doing. Mr. Spear, what is your assessment on this proposed Biden independent contractor rule and how it would impact your industry?
We've got about 350,000 independent contractors nationwide. California, as I mentioned, this AB5, 70,000 independent contractors in California. And every day we're moving, milk, eggs, bread to vaccines. I mean, if you want the things that you need and want, you're going to need a driver. We're already short 78,000. Now we're going to exacerbate that number with another 350,000 by making the requirements so vague that it literally makes the independent contractor, the 90-year-old model, irrelevant. This is about choice. Nobody's telling these people they have to go down this path. And there's laws in place and enforcement to take care of any abuses that occur out there. Not just those laws, but we've got boards, we've got commissions, federal, state, local enforcement. That will be handled accordingly.
And that's exactly why we wrote the Employee Rights Act.
That's right.
Was to give the American people choice. The American people want choice. And I agree 100% with you. Mr. Moore, thank you for your great work in analyzing our economic problems. I agree with you on workforce participation. The last time we balanced the budget in this country, we had almost 70% workforce participation in this country. That was 2001. And that was as a result of the legislation that President Clinton signed to promote work in this country and to get people out of poverty and into the workforce and to move up the food chain as fast as possible. And there's so many opportunities out there today. How do we change this? I mean, who is against giving somebody the opportunity and the dignity to hold a great job and to provide for their family?
Well, thank you, Congressman. Look, the evidence is crystal clear that what we did back in 1996 was a overriding success in every way. And a lot of the opponents said there would be blood literally on the House floor in this chamber, said there would be blood in the streets if we passed welfare reform, and exactly the opposite happened. And by the way, the biggest beneficiaries were a lot of the people who had been on welfare, who actually got into the workforce. I mean, look, you can't climb the ladder of economic success if you're collecting government benefits and not working. So it is really critically important to just restore all of the rules that we had in 1996. These work requirements began to be eviscerated under the Obama administration, and then they were the Biden administration has completely gotten rid of all of those reforms and work requirements. Right. We want a safety net. We want to make sure people don't go homeless or hungry, but we want to help them get in the workforce through training and they should be either looking for a job, in training, or in a job.
That's what America's all about, opportunity for all. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Ms. Wild, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Everybody wants people to be able to have good jobs that pay well and wants opportunity for everyone. I think we on both sides of the aisle absolutely agree on that. But this is about things that cost working folks money, quite frankly. And so I want to ask you, Dr. Shierholtz, about the joint employer rule. Your organization estimated that the Trump Department of Labor's joint employer rule would have cost American workers $1 billion. And yet, some of my colleagues across the aisle continue to advocate for legislation that would put this Trump-era rule into law. It would allow predatory companies to use contracting and subcontracting basically as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Can you tell us what that kind of legislation, passage of that kind of legislation, would mean for America's working families?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I want to take another second first to correct something that was just stated. The welfare reform of 1996 was not a resounding success. It looked like a resounding success if you only measure until the year 2000, because we had the strongest labor market at that time than we have had until the last 2 years. If you look past that, when the macroeconomy situation deteriorates, it does not look even close to being a success. So that's just important background that we need to have. Okay, on joint employer, yeah, what the joint employer rule that's being debated, or that's being...
Let me just restate, because you answered something else, and that's great, it was helpful. So what I'm really looking for, what would the consequences be of implementing this Trump-era joint employer rule for working families?
For implementing the Trump-era rule. So what that rule does is it makes it less possible for workers to to get all employers that control the terms and conditions of their employment to the bargaining table. And that means they can less effectively collectively bargain, and that leads to lower wages, lower benefits, worse
So I like to put things in really plain terms. If you have multiple employers, it's really hard to get them all to the table to negotiate pay, the right to organize, benefits, working conditions, and other things. Is that fair to say?
That's exactly right. An employer, who is not the lead employer, if a union wants to negotiate over, say, health insurance, and they're like, nope, that's controlled by the lead employer, I can't negotiate over that, that means the union is less able to effectively negotiate.
Okay. Thank you for that. And I also wanted to ask you about something about rulemaking that the NLRB initiated last September to rescind and replace the Trump administration's joint employer status standard. The Economic Policy Institute estimated that if it was implemented, the NLRB's proposed rule would increase annual worker earnings by over $1 billion. Again, I like plain talk. We would like working people to make more money. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
And how would this proposed joint employer status rule empower workers?
It's the opposite of what happened with the Trump rule. It would allow employees, workers who are in a union, to bring all the companies who control the terms and conditions of their employment to the bargaining table. That makes their bargaining more effective. It leads to higher wages.
So can I ask you this? Because I think sometimes there is this concern by small businesses, and quite frankly, they are egged on by some of our colleagues across the aisle in being concerned that it's somehow going to hurt them if they have this kind of rule. Can you tell us how small businesses might benefit under this rule?
Yeah, this is the thing that kind of boggles my mind in this discussion. Small businesses, franchisees, they're already on the hook for violations of labor law. I mean, it could be something that they're getting pressure from the franchisor or the lead company to violate labor law. But if the joint employer, but they are the only ones currently who are accountable. If we have a strong joint employer standard, then the lead company will also be accountable as well. It strengthens the position of the small business.
So it would, in a way, reduce the potential liability of a small business?
Yes, it means it's more broadly shared.
Thank you.
Yeah.
With that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Weil. Mr. Comer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let's go back to 2015. The National Labor Relations Board, comprised entirely of President Obama's appointees, created a broad definition of joint employment that put the franchise model at risk and threatened to erode small business owners' control of their operations. This action cost franchise businesses $33.3 billion per year and prevented the creation of 376,000 jobs over the next 5 years. Then, during a time of soaring prices, we saw the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division rescind the narrowly tailored joint employment rulemaking published under the Trump administration and released a proposed rulemaking reverting once again to the harmful Obama-era joint employer definition. Reversing the previous administration's actions has once again upended business owner stability and authority over settling the essential terms of employment for their employees. In my home state of Kentucky alone, any shift in the definition of joint employment affects 10,971 franchise locations, generating over $9.7 billion. Time and time again, those on the other side of the aisle have trampled on the rights of these small business owners and failed to provide clarity for their employees. That's why the Save Local Business Act is essential. Congress must codify a tailored, consistent joint employer standard to prevent infringement from government bureaucrats on our nation's entrepreneurs and job creators. To do this, I'm introducing the Save Local Business Act, which provides a stable definition of a joint employer as one which directly, actually, and immediately exercises significant control over the essential terms and conditions of employment. If this definition is not codified, franchisees across the country may be subject to further interference by future rulemakings, which could subject them to bargaining with unions for another employer's workers, making them targets of union dispute activities, or be held liable for another employer's unfair labor practices. Mr. Akers, can you explain how this legislation would help you grow your business?
Absolutely. We choose whether we are going to grow and add locations based on staffing. When you take that opportunity away from us, why would we continue to grow when somebody else is going to have oversight on those staff members? The only way we can do this, and frankly, why would somebody buy a new business, a new franchise, if they learn that they're not going to be able to make decisions about their employees? Saving local businesses, especially through the franchise model, it's critical to have that law put into place.
Mr. Spear, can you provide us some context about joint employer relationships within the trucking industry and how the Save Local Business Act would impact those wishing to franchise or enter into a joint employer relationship?
I think we need flexibility. I mean, we're trying to attract more talent into the industry. And let's be really honest why this is actually happening and why you have to introduce legislation like this. This is about increasing membership in unions. This is about generating more dues in unions. They've halved the amount of membership over the last 40 years. And this is a concerted effort to change the rules, change the laws, and channel more people into unions. And eliminating flexibility is about the worst thing that you can do right now in an economy that's trying to recover from COVID and trying to lead the world, candidly. Our industry is essential, and it proved that during COVID. And so any attempt to unravel our business models, eliminate our workforce by removing choice, we're going to oppose that rigorously. And just ask the employees. Just ask the independent contractors, why did they choose this path? You'll get the answer that you're looking for, and I think your legislation will be on track to preserving that.
Great. Well, Madam Chair, someone who's had ownership interest in a couple of different franchises, I can tell you, anyone who takes that significant risk of purchasing a franchise and understands the terms and conditions of that franchise agreement, then they're blindsided by federal bureaucrats on just out of the blue rulemaking that has a detrimental impact on their bottom line and on the significant risk and the work that they put into this. It's very unfortunate. It's a disincentive to attract investment, to create new jobs, to grow our economy. So look forward to working with you, Madam Chair, on this legislation. I want to thank the witnesses for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Comer. It's great when we have members who have a wide ranging of experiences themselves and can speak to the issues. Ms. Hayes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. Before I go into my questions, I just would like to flag for the committee. I represent the state of Connecticut, and I'd like to correct the record on some comments that were made in openings. Connecticut's unemployment rate is currently 4% as of February 2023. Our total unemployment in Connecticut is 76,000 people. In September 2022, Connecticut saw a 27% decrease in unemployment, the third largest drop since 1987. As of September 2023, 16,500 jobs have been created in Connecticut since President Biden took office, and 83,700 jobs have been created statewide. As of September 2022, 1,800 manufacturing jobs have been created in my district. In Connecticut, in my district, and 8,400 in statewide. In 2021, 27,000 workers in Connecticut were employed in clean energy and emerging sectors, and 9,600 applications to start a new business were filed in Connecticut, up from 6,100 the year before the pandemic. So blue state shutdowns did not stifle the economy, and Connecticut is an example of how we have used American Rescue Plan Act funds and other incentives by the Biden administration to stimulate our economy and get people back to work. Since President Biden took office, the economy has created 12.4 million jobs between 2019 and 2022. Low-wage workers experienced historically fast real wage growth, and wages at the 10th percentile grew 9% over the same 3-year period. The actions of congressional Democrats in the Biden administration have driven this wage growth. However, our work is not complete. Connecticut has recovered about 96% of the nearly 289,000 jobs lost during the pandemic, and job openings remain above pre-pandemic levels in Connecticut. Additional support from Congress can help fully equip workers with the skills they need to be competitive and provide employers with a highly productive workforce. Last year, in Congress, we passed the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA. This included my bill, the Youth Build for Futures Act, which would have provided $1 billion over 6 years for Youth Build and improved program support for vulnerable youth who are not in school or employed. Dr. Shierholtz, can you tell me what are the risks to state and local workforce development programs without the passage of an updated WIOA Act? And how will the lack of congressional action affect current hiring and employment conditions, especially as we try to fill these new and emerging economies?
The making sure that we have a workforce that's prepared for the modern economy is so incredibly important. I also think about this as we shift to a clean energy economy. We're going to be needing to make sure that people are really trained. So making sure these programs are really, really like the top-notch programs is incredibly important. One thing I really think that we need to focus on is union apprenticeship programs. Another key area is pre-apprenticeship programs. Pre-apprenticeship programs are one key way that you can get we can increase diversity in apprenticeships. You can really attract more women, black youth, other groups that may not otherwise end up in apprenticeship programs, and then setting up a pathway, clear pathway to good jobs, crucial.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, because as a teacher, I always believe that if we can expose young people to more opportunities much sooner, they would see all of the choices that are available to them. In the conclusion of your testimony, you emphasized the importance of expanding federal funding for apprenticeships and other workforce training programs to create pathways to higher paying jobs. Can you tell us how can workforce training and apprenticeships programs provide more protection for workers, and what role can these programs play in helping workers increase career mobility?
It creates opportunity. It means it gives a foot in the door. It creates the opportunity for being able to get on a career path that can lead to a family-sustaining job. It's just a crucial step for a huge swath of our labor market.
Thank you, Dr. Schultz. You're going to help, Dr. Shierholtz, you're going to help me get a gold star. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Owens, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ms. Shierholtz, I just have a quick question for you. Have you ever run a business?
Right now, I'm the president of an organization that has around 50 FTEs.
No, I'm not talking corporation, a business. Have you ever taken a risk, invested, had shareholders you have to kind of deal with or look at your profit?
I have not, but as I said,
Okay.
I now run an
Okay,
organization with
thank
50
you.
FTEs.
Well, we're talking about business ownership here, and I'll just say this, because we do have people on the desk here that's experts what they do for decades. A little bit of my history, and by the way, there's nothing wrong with government and business owner. Either one is okay. I think it's important to understand there's a need for both. I came in the NFL after 10 years and started a business, and 9 years failed totally, big time. Went to being a security guard in a chimney sweep. I never ever thought about being a government worker. I did get back in the corporate environment and always had a business on the side as an independent contractor. The reason why, because I wanted a choice. I wanted to have control. I wanted to have that I can dream past another person's job. Do you think that being in your position, it would be healthy to listen to other business owners, what they think? Since, Mr. Spears, how long have you been in your profession?
I've been in this role 7 years, and 2 years prior running our congressional office.
Okay.
So nearly 10 years.
Okay. Franchise?
Yeah, I've been in the franchise world for 17 years in corporate America, running businesses for 30 years before that.
Okay. Heritage and your, Mr. Moore, how long have you been doing what you're doing?
I've run 3 nonprofits, so I have not run a private for-profit business.
Okay.
But I take your point. I mean, this is, one of the problems with the Biden administration. We did this famous study that came out 6 months ago that of the 75 top economic, financial, transportation, energy officials in the Biden administration, the average number of years of business experience, median number is 0.
Okay. I think I need to make a point. First of all, I want to shout out to every business owner out there that's taking a risk. For many people who don't understand our free market, our great society, our great country, our freedom is built on our middle class. Our middle classes are those folks who have empathy, they have a vision, they want a good name, and they look back and try to invest back in their community. That middle class is powered by business owners. The business owners and the middle class is what pays your salary, because it's the excess, it's the profit. I think when you talk about things like the PRO Act, why don't you talk to the experts? I'm trying to understand how government workers get to this point where, because you're good at one area, you're experts at everything else. We're telling you that this country is built on business ownership, on taking risk. I've been a risk taker, and again, personalities, we have different personalities. Some are more risk averse. I happen to be one of those guys who like risk, because I think to get my dream, I'll have to take some more. So it's okay to not want to be a risk taker, but don't take away the dreams and hopes and choices for those who do. This country has always been built on business ownership, and we need to make sure we understand that the threat to our nation today is this mentality that we have this central force that knows everything and can dictate every single step in our lives in terms of what we do and what we don't do, what choice we have, what choice we don't, and we cannot afford to do that. I wanted to ask a real quick question, Ms. Akers. You state in your testimony there's over 790,000 franchise establishments employ 8.4 million workers. I want you to keep in mind, it's not government who hires these people. These are business owners. There are a lot of business and workers who serve millions of customers and help drive our economy. We need to ensure businesses like yours can expand, hire, and serve customers. As a franchisee, what specific regulations or policies do you believe are hindering your ability to address workforce challenges?
Well, the number one right now is the fear of the PRO Act going through, because we certainly won't be able to do anything with that. We give better benefits and pay to our staff than anybody else could regulate, and we will lose that impact if we do this, because it'll be a one-size-fits-all thing. And I thank you for what you're doing, Mr. Owens.
I'll say this. I'm so thankful that American people have given us an opportunity to stand for who they are. The Republican Conference stands for faith, family, the free market, and education. It's for risk takers. And I can promise you we'll do everything we can to make sure we do not allow this PRO Act, this anti-American, anti-free market PRO Act to go through. And we'll make sure we educate the American people. Let them know if you dream, go for it. If you want to work for government, go for it. But do not stop those who power the middle class. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Owens. Ms. Leisure Fernandez, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so very much, Ranking Member Scott and Chairwoman Fox, for putting together this panel, talking today. You know, I spent 2 days ago, I spent time with Dolores Huerta, who, as you know, is such a champion for workers' rights and human rights. It was wonderful to be with her, as she is 92 years old and still marching for workers' rights, and spending the time talking to New Mexicans and others about the importance of unionization of unions. Dolores and Cesar understood what we do when faced with economic and income inequality. We give workers more power. We pay workers what they deserve. That's what we did with the billions of dollars in spending in the infrastructure bill. We wrote into the law a requirement that workers get paid what they deserve. Americans know that this is the right thing to do as well. We have the highest rate of approval for unions since 1965, 71% approval for unions. So Americans recognize the value of unions. We know that they are key to achieving fair pay, to maintaining safe working conditions, to recognizing the dignity of each person's work. That is key to our country's success. Dr. Shierholtz, your organization has repeatedly found evidence that unions shrink both racial and gender wage gaps while raising wages for all workers. The drop in union membership since the late 1970s has, you've shown us, taken $58 a week out of the paychecks of non-union working without a college degree. So it's across the board. Can you tell us a bit more how collective bargaining levels the playing field for workers, especially those without a college degree?
Thank you for that question. So what unions, the empirical evidence is just clear. Unions workers who are in a union make about 10% more than similar workers who are not in unions. They have higher benefits. They have better working conditions, better scheduling, more likely to have vacation, health care, retirement benefits. Like the sort of list is endless. They have voice on the job. So if there's an issue at work, they actually have a mechanism to be able to communicate to their employers, which can make the workplace safer. It can provide real innovative ideas for the workplace. So it is what they do is just provide some countervailing power to workers, to sort of the inherent employer power, make the economy better off.
Thank you so very much. And you know, the other major concern we have is protecting our babies, protecting our children. And many of whom are migrants from Latin America fleeing the worst horrors from egregious labor conditions. Dr. Shierholtz, a new report from your organization finds that the number of minors employed in violation of child labor laws has increased 37% in the last year and skyrocketed 283% since 2015. Chair Fox, I seek unanimous consent to enter this report into the record.
Without objection.
I want to get to thanking Mr. Spear in your testimony for highlighting the Safe Driver Apprenticeship Program and the Women of Trucking Advisory Board. Thank you very much for noting those. Both of these programs, I will note, were created by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as you pointed out, correct? I will note that not one of our Republican colleagues on this committee voted for those important apprenticeship programs. But going back to you, Dr. Shierholtz, how have recent state-level rollbacks in child labor protections exacerbated the issue around child labor?
There have been 10 states, bills passed to roll back child labor standards over the last 2 years alone. It's just remarkable that we are now having this debate about whether 14-year-olds should work in meat packing plants. Like that we're going back to this idea of children in factories is actually kind of mind-boggling. It's the idea that people are saying we need this is because of labor shortages, but the economics tells you there is a hard and fast way to solve a labor shortage. You raise wages. That's how you attract workers. So the idea that instead of raising wages for grown-ups, we would instead use what is inevitably the most vulnerable, economically precarious youth to fill those roles. It's just, it's absolutely unthinkable.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for that. And I would also note that we have passed the last session, the Congress, the House passed immigration reform, the Farm Worker Modernization Act, and various other acts that would also allow for immigrant workers to participate, which has impacted our labor force. It would be a $1.4 trillion economic benefit if we did that. My time has passed, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Williams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. You know, before I entered here today, I actually was concerned about our economy and concerned about inflation. I was concerned about real wages. I was concerned about a lot of things, but some of the testimony I've heard and questions I've heard, we're living in the greatest economic time in history, and with practically full employment, and it's practically a worker's paradise. And I'm also ashamed to say that my children have held jobs since they were 16 of their own volition, and it's too late now to go back and stop them from the enormous success that they're having in academics and in their professional lives, to prevent the scarring that obviously was done by this terrible tragedy. So my own personal experience is actually quite different. Mr. Moore, we've heard this celebration of the unemployment rate, and yet it seems maybe not all is well. Can you talk about the employment participation rate and what your observation has been and why that's important, please, sir?
Just a word about what you said about people working at younger ages. You know, the statistics are pretty clear that the earlier you start working, the more successful you are in your life. When I worked for 10 years at the Wall Street Journal, we had so many successful people come in every area of life, whether it's music, arts, finance, business. And I'd always ask them, what did you do when you were growing up? And I was struck by how many people grew up on farms, because if you're someone like my wife who grew up on a farm, you start working when you're 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 years old, and you establish a work habit. I'm not saying I'm against getting rid of child labor laws. I'm just saying you're right. 13, 14, 15-year-olds probably should be doing after-school work and things like that to build up their skills. They'll be more successful in life. Look, the economy is. I'm with the 67% of Americans who just think this economy is really fragile. The labor market is strong. The job market is strong today. There's no question about it. It's about as strong as I've seen. The problem is people are getting poorer. Every month that Joe Biden has been in office, the average Americans get poorer and poorer and poorer and poorer, because when you have inflation running, at 15% over the last 2 years, in other words, over that whole period, and wages are only up by 10%, guess what? Your purchasing power declines. It's exactly what happened in the 1970s, by the way, and then the economy collapsed. So I don't think Americans are feeling the love for this economy, and I think we have to do real reforms. And the main point is, let's encourage people to get into the workforce. You're not going to get out of poverty if you don't have a job, and the jobs are out there. So that's my take on where we are. And look, if we continue to spend and borrow as we've done with this $6 trillion massive increase in our debt, and I find that to be incredibly dangerous. I think we will have a financial crisis in this country if we don't start balancing our budget right away.
This is a true statement. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. You can't lie to the American people about the economy. They live it every day. The truth is, working Americans have fallen 10 years behind in wages, in real wages, and that's a shame. And it's because of inflation. It's because of the policies, particularly the last 2 years, but not exclusively of the last 2 years. Right now, 63% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And with the rising costs that are rising faster than their wages, they're falling further and further behind through no fault of their own. And we, members of Congress, and yourselves, even as business owners or policy experts, really deserve or really owe working Americans an answer on why that's true. And there's a certain compact that we've made with working Americans. If you finish high school, if you get a job, if you show up, if you continue to add skills, you're going to be okay. And you're going to be able to support a family. You're going to be able to have maybe a nicer car than your neighbor. Maybe you can get a few toys along the way. This is really what people in my district live for, and God bless them for it. And through no fault of their own, because of our energy policies, this is sliding further and further away. And they want to know what happened. They're not political activists. They're not PhDs in economics. They didn't go to Wharton. And they really want some answers, and they want some actions. Right now, we are telling ourselves fibs about the economy. We're saying that we're bridging to a new golden carbon-free economy that will impoverish the middle class. We're saying that there's a worker nirvana just over the horizon if we just had more regulation, and that is not true, and it's been proven false throughout all of history. So I appreciate your comments, and I appreciate you standing up here and speaking the truth about the economy where it could be discerned. Thank you. I yield back, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Ms. Stevens, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our distinguished panelists for being with us here this morning on the education and Labor Committee hearing for this topic of unleashing America's opportunities for hiring and employment. It is something that is quite acute to us in southeastern Michigan, Oakland County, where I represent, a manufacturing destination with 2.5% unemployment. We got a tight labor market, and frankly, I believe that we have the best practice example of American Rescue Act dollars at play. And look, we have been through a tumultuous season with the COVID-19 pandemic. We've also had economic turbulence for markers throughout this century. If it is the Great Recession, which took us time to dig out of, it wasn't until April of 2014 when total employment reached its pre-recession level, and that was after actions that we took with the Recovery Act. This is work that we heard from at the local level where it said, hey, it's time to invest, right? We've got to invest fully to fully be able to recover. And certainly on this committee, we're looking at and evaluating the experience of our low-wage workers, our lower-wage workers, and how to lift people out of poverty and bring people into the middle class, which is why many of us have pushed for a long time to raise the minimum wage. But Dr. Shierholtz, we recently marked the 2-year anniversary of President Biden's American Rescue Plan. I know we're talking about this in today's hearing, and I wanted to just directly ask you that in terms of the harm to workers that was avoided because of the important investments that were made in this package, we believe, and many of us in this committee believe, tie people to jobs, right? Let's make sure that people stay tethered to jobs. Let's not leave people in long-term unemployment. But could you speak to the experience of workers and harm that was avoided because of the steps that were taken with the American Rescue?
I totally appreciate this question, and I just want to quickly correct something that was just said before I do that. That this idea that U.S. workers have fallen 10 years behind in real wages. That's just empirically false. If you look since 2019, workers at every point of the wage distribution have higher wages now than they did then, and those at the very bottom of the wage distribution have wages now that are 9% higher than they were then. So
people are making more money.
They are making more money than they did pre-COVID. I'm not saying inflation wasn't a big hit, but over that period, nominal wages have grown enough to make up for that. Okay, so ARPA, I think that this question, we only have to look to what happened after the Great Recession to show what we just avoided by passing ARPA. In the aftermath of the Great Recession, it took 10 years to get back down to the pre-recession unemployment rate. Weak recoveries, which is what we saw then, they churn out inequality, they churn out racial inequity, they churn out lost opportunities. ARPA kept that from happening. The scale of the inequality that didn't widen, the racial inequities that didn't get worse, the opportunities that were not lost are just pretty staggering to think about.
And we're utilizing ongoing ARP investments to rebuild the state and local private sector workforce. This is a place where we've partnered with AFSCME and heard from AFSCME very directly on. And so are there other examples of how ARP has supported lower wage workers, particularly at the state and local level, to continue to grow that workforce?
Yeah, that's actually, that's a mixed bag, right? When we look at the private sector has just gone like gangbusters over the last 2 years. The public sector is growing, but not as fast of a rate, and there's still a really big gap. So state and local governments, particularly some of them, are using the relief that was in the American Rescue Plan to raise pay and hire those workers back, but others aren't doing that as much and should be doing that more. It's K through 12. It's teachers. Those are we absolutely
stabilizing
need to,
our schools.
Yes, we need to.
Are you
do more.
familiar with the statistic that our country rebounded economically the fastest of any nation coming out of COVID-19?
I haven't looked at the global stuff, but you can look at history in the U.S. And that is true for past recessions in the U.S. Like what we did now, it was just an unbelievable policy achievement.
Thank you. Unbelievable policy achievement. With that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bank, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Spear, Indiana is one of the most active trucking industries in the United States. In late 2021, the ATA put out the following press release on the Biden administration's vaccine mandate and how it would threaten the trucking industry and cripple the nation's supply chain. Can you elaborate more on those mandates, or even just the threat of those mandates, and how they impacted your industry and our supply chain?
Well, I'm quick to point out that the Trump administration, President Trump, Biden administration, President Biden, didn't create a global pandemic. Okay, you play the hand you're dealt. And, you know, when you're trying to recover economically, you're trying to navigate the pitfalls of a pandemic like this, get people vaccinated, keep it from spreading. You don't make it worse. And this is an administration that you know, well exceeded the statutory authority of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. OSHA does not have the authority to regulate vaccine mandates. So when this was put out, we joined another number of others in suing, took it through 2 federal district courts to the Supreme Court and got a 6-3 decision and bounced it because we knew they didn't have the authority. We knew this was semantics, that this wasn't going to solve the problem. Our drivers, by the way, throughout COVID, got in the truck and delivered everything that we need, including the vaccine, the PPE. We did that. You know, you're welcome. You're welcome. So to put out a mandate for people that are getting in the cab, that are isolated largely from being exposed to COVID, and are keeping our economy glued together, had to be one of the most ridiculous policy ideas I've ever heard. And they deserve to get bounced in the Supreme Court, and we as an industry will continue to exercise our legal rights when we see it's warranted.
Well, I agree with you. It remains unclear if the border vaccine requirements for non-U.S. citizens coming to the United States is going to end on May 11th. The Canadian Trucking Alliance has said this mandate has affected thousands of unvaccinated truck drivers in Canada and Mexico by preventing them from entering the United States. If the Biden administration's border vaccine requirements remain in place and truckers from Canada and Mexico remain unable to come to the United States, how will that affect our trucking industry and the supply chains throughout North America?
That's a dramatic impact. We're moving literally 73% of the USMCA freight. So we were supporting NAFTA and now USMCA. There isn't really anything that we don't eat, drink, or wear that doesn't come off a truck. There's a driver behind the wheel to make sure that happens. And yes, we rely on Canadian and Mexican drivers, you know, to support that, to support the supply chain. So these mandates matter, and it's really comes down to diplomacy. Work with your Canadian counterparts and your Mexican counterparts so that we can maintain seamless policies with respect to vaccinations that don't have an adverse impact on the economy. It's not that difficult, but we're not communicating with our counterparts. And that's a big problem where you have these disparities. It has a measurable impact on trade and the economy. And we're the ones to bear it as an industry. We feel it first before anybody else.
Seems like common sense. We appreciate all you do to represent Hoosier truck drivers. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Mr. Mervan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox. Dr. Shierholtz, some 70% of Americans have a favorable view of unions, and some 48% of workers who are not in union like to belong to one. However, union density is only at about 10%. Why is there such a wide gap?
Yeah, that's a, oh, sorry. I got it. That's, thank you for that question. I think it's really important. There is just that gap between the share of workers who want to be in a union and the share of workers who are actually in a union. That's policy. That gap is policy. That is policy that has not kept up with employer aggressiveness in fighting unions, that has really undermined workers' actual right to be in a union.
Okay. So I represent Northwest Indiana, heavy on industry, manufacturing, and have a strong union presence. And the ability to collectively bargain and create a safe workplace is extremely important. And so from my perspective, there is absolutely a role for union. And of course, there's a role for small businesses also. And I just also want to say, as a local elected official, I was a North Township trustee, and we were in charge of emergency poor relief. I did that for 15 years. And one of the programs that we worked with Ivy Tech, which is a community college, and this was in 2006, it was to train and operate people to get their CDL license, to have a pipeline, so people would come into our office and we would try and find people, instead of giving out direct aid, try and help them find a job. But the trucking industry in 2006 was in great need of drivers. So when you, Mr. Spears, utilize the 78,000 drivers needed now and 136,000 needed 10 years or down the line, that is actually really a cycle that has existed for a long time. The trucking industry has been in great need of drivers at least since 2006. Is that correct?
That is correct. We like to say post-COVID, welcome to the show. We've been short for a very long time.
Right. And there are multiple things that get in the way of CDLs and those opportunities, which is a phenomenal career path for those individuals. I guess what my point is today is we do all have to work together in order to shore up the workforce, to be able to create synergies that allow people to get into the CDLs and to drive so that our freight is able to maneuver around. And when it comes to unionized labor, there is a role in our country because there has been exploitations of workers, and our history has shown that. And that's why it is so vitally important within my district to be able to protect working men and women. And just taking this opportunity, also closing the wage gap for African American and women. Unions have done a great job in that. Union women who are of color make 93 cents on the dollar, where those who are non-union make about 78 cents on the dollar. So as a father of 2 daughters, I want to make sure that there's equality throughout all of that, and unions have helped do that. And so part of this committee's ability is to make sure that we are, or mission from my view, is to make sure that we have equality and opportunity for all workers. So I thank you all very much for your testimony, and with that I yield back Chairman Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Mervan. Ms. Miller, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for yielding, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. My first question is for Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, my constituents are very concerned about the collapse of the U.S. dollar. How do you think President Biden's proposal to spend $82.2 trillion over the next 10 years, including $2.5 trillion in new mandatory spending, is going to impact the dollar in the long run?
Well, Congresswoman, inflation is, by definition, a reduction in the purchasing power of the dollar. And that's what your constituents are seeing month after month after month. It is not true that real wages are rising. Real wages have fallen in the last 2 years. There's a lot of different estimates, but the kind of median one that we looked at Heritage is that the average worker's lost about $3,500 to $4,000 in 2 years. And look, if you're making $70,000 a year, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money that people are losing because of, and I think the inflation is a direct result. It's like the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. If you spend $6 trillion you don't have, you're going to get inflation, right? We predicted it would happen, and it did happen. It went up to 9.1% in the summer of 2020. Fortunately, it's come down to 6%. I think it's going to continue to drift down, but the damage has really been done. So there's been long-lasting negative effects to this $6 trillion spending spree. We will, in my opinion, Congresswoman, be spending decades to undo the damage that has been done in the last 2 years.
We need to add the study of economics into our required courses. Maybe that'll help us there. Thank you. Could you tell us how President Biden's reckless spending and foreign policy incompetence could lead to the Chinese currency replacing the US dollar as the world's reserve currency?
I'll answer your question this way. I think I would love it if every decision that you made here in Congress on both sides of the aisle was about how do we make the United States and the American workers the most competitive in the world. We all agree in this room we want the American workers to be the highest paid workers in the world and the most skilled workers. Frankly, we're not taking competitiveness seriously right now as a country. When you run $6 trillion of debt, do you think that makes America more competitive? Obviously, no. When you dismantle a lot of American energy, we get 75% of our energy, folks, from fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. That's how we provide the power that keeps our trucks running and our factories running. Look, we're not going to run a $23 trillion economy on windmills. It's just a stupid idea, and it just plays into the hands of our enemies. So who's benefited from these anti-American energy policies? Well, let's see, China, Russia, the OPEC countries, and so on. So one of my frustrations, having worked in the Trump administration, the last 6 months, I mean, there's been, look, the last 6 months that Trump was in office, the economy grew by 11%. The economy was booming. We saw huge, nobody thought the recovery could happen as quickly from when we shut down the American economy. So if we just stuck with the Trump policies, I happen to think the U.S. economy, we wouldn't be talking about, the high inflation. We wouldn't be talking about massive increases in debt. We wouldn't be talking about these problems with small businesses. So the policies worked that we put in place in Trump. I'm a little biased. I helped put those in place. But as I said, earlier, we had the best economy ever right before COVID. And we've got to get back to the things that work.
If the Chinese currency does replace the US dollar, what kind of risks are we looking at? If that actually happens.
It's a security crisis. It's an economic crisis. It is incredibly important for the whole security of the world, not just the United States, and the economic well-being of the world, that the United States retain its world economic superpower status and that the dollar remain the dominant currency. Now, I don't think there's an immediate danger of some other country like the euro or the yuan or these other countries taking over the United States currency. But if we continue to rack up our debt, because as you know, Congresswoman, we're headed to $50 trillion in debt in less than 10 years. If that happens, then I think that America's status as the world reserve currency will be put in great danger.
Thank you. And moving on, Mr. Speer, given the workforce challenges your industry is facing, can you offer any specific ideas or suggestions this committee and Congress might consider that would make the workforce development system and overall pipeline for the next generation of American workers more efficient for them and their employers?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Congresswoman. In brief, and I can provide more detail on what our recommendations with WIOA and reauthorization. Let's try to turn COVID into something a little more positive. This is a global pandemic. None of us have ever experienced it. And we witnessed something, tragic, but also pretty phenomenal. We saw a lot of sectors of our workforce come together and support our economy, got us through the pandemic. Isolate those. Work with your other fellow committees to understand what segments of our workforce really contributed when it mattered most. I'm pretty darn proud of our 3.8 million drivers getting into their cabs, getting the food, the toilet paper where it needed to be, but also the vaccines, the PPE, the test kits. We did all of that. And it's a remarkable contribution. If you look at the nurses, the doctors, the EMTs, the people that went to people's doors and helped them get to the hospital and get the care they needed, these are segments of our workforce that contributed when it mattered most. We need to identify them and reward and incentivize them.
I'm going to have to ask you to wrap it up, Ms. Miller, because your time is over.
Okay, thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Courtney, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Dr. Shierholtz, when we're talking about protecting the U.S. currency, the 600-pound gorilla right now is the approaching default in terms of the full faith and credit of our paper. Last January, the Treasury Secretary notified the world that we actually had hit the debt limit cap, and that special measures are the only thing that right now protects the dollar and protects our paper from really getting degraded and down valued, which is exactly what happened in 2011 when the brinksmanship was played here. I was around for that and remember it well. And so again, if you could just sort of clarify that, if we're talking about protecting the currency of this country, which is a very valid concern because China would like to take over as the dominant currency, allowing this country to sleepwalk into a full default is the quickest way to have that nightmare occur. Is that correct?
That's right. Defaulting on the debt would be just an absolute catastrophe. For sure cause a deep recession. Like, there's no question that that would be an unbelievably catastrophic self-inflicted wound. Cutting a big deal to keep that from happening also would be a big self-inflicted wound, like we did in 2011, where that 2011 deal to increase the debt ceiling, but at the same time impose massive austerity was the thing that led to the incredibly weak and slow recovery that we had from the Great Recession.
And thank you for mentioning that, because you're right. The sequestration agreement that was put into place, suppressed growth in terms of both the defense and non-defense portions of the federal budget, and as a result, depressed growth. Ironically, when President Trump was elected, one of the first things that the Republicans did was to lift sequestration, which their crisis that they created back in 2011, that's where the fingerprints were in terms of putting that into place. But actually lifting sequestration benefited the economy, as you, I think, noted in your testimony.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. It was like Republicans held that austerity stance until Trump was in office, lifted that, and it actually provided substantial stimulus to the economy in the final years of the Trump administration.
And as long as we're talking about those 4 years, we actually voted as a Congress really with no drama in terms of lifting the debt limit 3 times to the tune of $8 trillion. And again, I think we should have a legitimate debate in this country about reducing the deficit, but using the lever of default as a way of basically putting this country at gunpoint in terms of having to adopt policies that fall outside the appropriations process and the authorizing process is again another recipe for, again, suppressing growth in this country. Isn't that correct?
Yes, and the debt limit makes no economic sense. Like, it is not empirically correlated with any measure of actual fiscal health in the economy. It's just an absolutely arbitrary number. To have so much be at stake because of such an arbitrary level, it's just it's just unthinkable that that's how we. That's
again,
where we
so
are.
To me, there's just no question that if we really want to do something to help this country, is that we need to fix this problem, because the Chinese would love to de-dollarize the world economy in terms of being, again, the international standard in terms of every transaction, whether it's energy, trade, I mean, you name it. Again, talking about how we deal with the labor participation rate in this country, which is, I think that's a valid concern that everybody, regardless of party, should be focused on. I would note, to follow up Mr. Moore's kind of rabbit punch on Connecticut, actually our labor participation rate is higher than other parts of the country. Again, I represent a district which is very defense heavy. We have Electric Boat Shipyard, which right now, because of the Biden defense budgets over the last 2 years, actually has a stable horizon in terms of submarine production. Last year, they hired just shy of 4,000 workers. The total shipyard is at 19,500 workers. This year's projected hiring rate is 5,750. Those are metal trades, design, engineering, and administration. Again, they're doing great with job fairs. There's one tomorrow, actually in New London. If anyone's listening, you're welcome to stop in. And they also are using the WIOA Workforce Board pre-apprenticeship training pathway in terms of connecting people and again, increasing the participation rate in the region. 10 weeks for a welder, 8 weeks for an electrician, 8 weeks for a CNC machinist. And again, if we're talking about ways to try and raise participation rate, there's a skills gap. that is definitely holding people back. That is precisely what domestic spending and the Department of Labor through WIOA actually addresses. And maybe you could comment on that.
You know what? That just made me think of another, because I totally agree with what you said. And then another key reason, if we really want to raise labor force participation rate, is we need to do things like maternity leave, paternity leave, childcare, paid leave. Like, those are the things that are keeping people out of the labor force when they're not there, particularly women. Like, women's labor force participation rate in the U.S. is falling so far behind our peer countries who have all of those things, and that's the difference. So that's another, like, they're both avenues to really get, in the long run, get labor force participation up.
So again, there's just no question that if we increase the number of slots for pre-apprenticeship training in the metal trades, we would hit that goal this year of 5,700 hires. And I would just note, because I just was the speaker at an apprenticeship graduating class 3 weeks ago, which again, it was folks in the metal trades. It was very, I've been to the UConn Go Huskies, commencement ceremonies, to, a lot of other universities that are there. Going to an apprenticeship graduation ceremony in some ways is the most inspiring, to see how people have transformed their lives using a pathway out of sort of traditional education and connecting to high-value, good-paying jobs that can support themselves and their family and do something really important for our nation. I yield back.
Mr. Courtney, I want to note that we failed to turn the clock on when you began, so you had about 7.5 minutes. Okay. So, Ms. Houchin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for coming to testify before us today. We appreciate your time. As you may know, Indiana's state motto is the crossroads of America. Hoosiers take pride in the fact that highways 40 and 41 were part of the original federal highway system in 1926, and today 724 million tons of freight travels through our state, making us the 5th busiest state for commercial freight traffic. Mr. Spear, I want to thank the trucking industry for what our American truckers did to contribute a great deal during COVID to get products on store shelves and to our homes. I want to express our thanks for the hard work of truckers working through the pandemic to make sure that things were delivered. It wasn't perfect. Supply chain issues persist, but the trucking industry did not let us down during COVID, and we thank you. Mr. Spear, in your written testimony, you mentioned a talent shortage of nearly 78,000 drivers and 41,000 as a severe workforce challenge to the trucking industry. Those numbers are a bit shocking, particularly considering that drivers in Indiana now average about $60,000 a year and can access full benefits. So could you touch on some of the other factors that contribute to your workforce challenges?
Yeah, as we said earlier, we've been dealing with the shortage of talent for a number of years, certainly predating COVID. It certainly got worse post-pandemic. As fewer people were returning to work across all specters of the economy, and trucking was certainly not isolated from that. So it inflated from about 50,000 drivers to 78,000. Our technician shortage is from 29,000 to 41,000. We're even short on dock workers. It is very difficult to get people to come back into the workforce. Pay has gone up over the last 5 years for drivers 19%, higher than any other mode in transportation. So you don't have to have a college degree. You don't carry all the debt that comes with it. We really need to make this an attractive place for all ages, 18 to 20. If you're in your latter years, we have an aging workforce, higher than national average. We need to provide the wellness programs. We provide the health benefits. We provide the paid leave. We provide all of that, and yet we're still short talent.
Yeah.
So this is problematic. Training, certainly investing in education and workforce development is going to be key. We're going to be really focused on WIOA and helping you design a bill that really focuses on the segments of our workforce that not only contributed through COVID, but are instrumental for our supply chain, our economy, and the ability to get those 40-year highs in inflation down.
So recognizing there's no silver bullet, a couple of things that may help would be the Drive Safe Act, or one thing that has been discussed during my time in government is transferring military CDLs to a civilian CDL. So those are some of the things, would you agree, that would be helpful?
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of many things, but the 18 to 20 populace, I said earlier, in exchange, 49 states allow an 18-year-old to drive. They can't cross state lines. We want them to do that, but we want them to do it safely and responsibly. So the training and the technology that was in IIJA, it's something we support, but we need to do it responsibly. But looking at the military, I mean, nobody in Congress I've heard is arguing against sending an 18-year-old over to protect our freedom, yet we do it all the time. The key there is teaching young people how to do their jobs safely and responsibly, and that's no different than what the trucking industry is asking for with respect to that talent pool.
Okay, thank you. With my remaining time, Mr. Akers, Iowa has been a right-to-work state since 1947. Indiana has been a right-to-work state since 2012, and we were the 23rd state in the nation to be right-to-work. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that in Indiana, manufacturing employment increased by 13.5% following right-to-work, compared to, on average, of just 0.5% during the same period for non-right-to-work states. When we provide workers with fundamental free choice rights through right-to-work, aren't we opening up economic opportunity? And if we had something like the PRO Act, wouldn't we stifle economic opportunity, in your opinion?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Our workers move all the time. We're in a business where they could go down the street and get another job right now. So, frankly, they are making more money than they ever made before. Our wages are up close to 30%. So the PRO Act really just adds a regulation. Frankly, the cost of regulation in small business comes from employees and customers. Because we have to pay for that somehow, that's where it's going to come from.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Desaulniers, you're recognized for 5 minutes, and if you're good, you get a gold star.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm still waiting for my last gold star, but I trust you. Dr. Shierholtz, taken by, you alluded to John Kenneth Galbraith's countervailing institutions, which I'm a big believer in. And so from a historical perspective, it's frustrating that we get into these arguments, and you don't have to read all of Thomas Piketty to accept that a accurate, objective analysis is there's got to be a balance. And we're not looking at, I mean, I get frustrated with free market as designed in this building, institution, that we live in a mixed market, and we've gone a long way from, people are going to get sick of me using the Eisenhower quote, where he said, at the greatest expansion period in the history of this country, or probably any economy, when we had a vibrant middle class during his administration, that he said, President Eisenhower said, only a fool would try to stop an American man or woman from attempting to organize if they choose. So I agree with the other people, it should be a choice, but we have to have these countervailing institutions. And I worry about this economy, and I agree with Mr. Moore on the purchasing power of middle-class people. But my perspective as to the causes is different, which I believe you share. So how do we deal with the inequality in terms of capital versus wages that has gotten worse in the last 3 years? That's the way I perceive President Biden's initiatives. It's not trying to empower unions for the sake of unions. You need these countervailing institutions in order to get real purchasing power up that hasn't been up since the 70s.
You said it perfectly. Like, I think of, when you think of an employer, the employer has inherent power over an individual worker. The employer loses the worker, it's just one worker. The worker loses, the employer loses their job. That's their livelihood. There's just an inherent imbalance of power. Things like unions, things like minimum wages provide a countervailing power to workers to create more balance, to create a fairer and stronger growing economy. But the sort of neoliberal deregulatory policies of the last 40 years have really broken that down, and we have seen the result. Skyrocketing inequality and much slower growth, because we didn't have that bottom-up, middle-out growth that really fuels strong growth. And so we can kind of we know the playbook, right? Like, to reverse the things that were undone to create the scene we're in now. So raise the minimum wage, raise overtime protections, change labor laws so workers who want to join a union are able to join a union, and on and on and on. Those things will make a massive difference.
And for the middle class and for consumers, I'm sorry that my colleague isn't still here, but having owned small businesses for 35 years in the restaurant business that has amongst the highest mortality rates, I always looked at my employees being paid well, but I had to be competitive for people who were playing by the rules. And sometimes in California, almost a third of the small businesses were in the underground economy. So we knew that they weren't paying their sales tax. They weren't paying well, I had to compete with them. And it drove this dynamic. But my question is consistent with what Nobel Prize winning Mr. Stiglitz says. You've got to have enough money for your employees to go out and buy the product. It's the Ford rule, right? Yep. If my workers can't buy the Model T, I'm not going to be successful. So again, could you respond to that?
Yep, it really is that, like, getting money in the pockets of people who are very likely to spend it, low and middle income workers. That makes our economy stronger, more resilient, faster growing. That is where we need to go from here to sort of halt and reverse some of the trends of rising inequality and weak growth that we've seen over the last 40 years.
Mr. Moore, you have had some controversy in things you have said vis-a-vis labor laws. There's a lot of information. I think the New York Times or the Post is doing stories now about the tension where more and more young people are working. I won't remind you of your quote, but I could give it to you that you did at the 2016 GOP convention. How do we keep a balance here? I don't disagree with everything you say, but clearly that quote, you've got to make sure that people are protected as well. Would you care to respond to that?
Well, one of the things that we were proudest of in the Trump administration was the record high expansion of middle class income. So median household income prior to COVID hitting, COVID changed everything. Median household income grew by $6,200, which was almost twice as much as in 8 years under Obama. So we kind of know what works. I completely agree with what you're all saying, that yes, let's build a middle class.
Mr. Moore, I was asking about the disenfranchising of the labor laws, taking away the labor laws. So I'll remind you of your quote. Yeah. I'm a radical on this. I'd like to have 11-year-olds be able to work.
I would defer to my colleagues. They know much more about that issue than I do. I'm not an expert on that by any means.
Artfully done. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. Burleson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox. Mr. Spear, I want to point you to, I think it was what is my new constituent.
Dee Sova.
Her name is Dee Sova, and I'm proud to have her as a constituent because if you look at her record, it's impeccable. This is a person who has 27 years of driving experience, over 2 million accident-free miles, and she established the Divas Rock organization to encourage more women to get into the trucking industry, she's just a real leader. But sadly, she made the news, and this is why I know about her. She made the news because she left California and moved to Southwest Missouri, God's country, to work with Prime Trucking. And tell me about why did she do that?
Well, I guess California's loss is Missouri's gain. She's a wonderful contributor to the economy, certainly to Prime, but she's an independent contractor. African-American, mother, putting her kids through college. She understands what it takes to be successful, not just as a mother, but as a business person. And she left California simply because of the regulatory headwinds that were being put on independent contractors, this AB 5 included, and relocated to Missouri because she knew she could have a successful business model working for Prime, raising her kids, being responsible. But that was her choice. Nobody told her to do that, to pay her less, or to deny her medical benefits. She got all of that in spades. She also knows that her work satisfaction, her pay, her benefits are actually higher under the business model she chose than if she drove as a fleet. It works for her, and it should be her decision, not the government's.
right? But we in government like to think that we're smarter than folks like Dee Sova, right? We like to think that she shouldn't be doing this. She should be a captive employee and so that she can probably pay dues.
Well, it's certainly to bolster the union membership and dues. I think this is pandering. I mean, these bills are designed for that purpose alone. If you talk to Dee Sova, it's her choice.
Yeah.
She wants to be in a union, she could be in a union. She could certainly make that decision on her own.
And she could have made the choice to become an employee and stay in California and receive those benefits because they were offered. That's a path that was fully available, but she chose, like many people. What has been the impact of California? We're talking about the anecdote, but what is the full impact?
The bottom line, when you're short 78,000 drivers nationwide, 350,000 drivers in the country are independent contractors. If AB 5 goes forward, that's 70,000 independent contractors in California. You almost doubled just from that bill becoming law, the number of drivers were short. She wants to be successful. It's her choice. She's very savvy. She's an America's Road Team captain. We pick them every 2 years. They're the best of the best. They have the best safety records of any drivers out there. She's a success story. And like many drivers, owner-operators, independent contractors, and fleet drivers, some of the smartest business people you will ever come across.
Thank you, Mr. Spear. I'm actually looking forward, hopefully, to meeting her someday. Mr. Moore, I think in Congress we have a lot of what I would call economic science deniers, right? At the end of the day, economics is the study. It's a scientific field, correct?
You know, that's a good question. Is it a science or a theology? I think a little bit of both.
So let me ask you this question. Can we end poverty by raising the minimum wage? Let's say we wanted everyone in America to make $50 an hour. Certainly that would end poverty, would it not?
You know, look, my opinion on the minimum wage is the best way to get wages up in America is to have better skilled, better trained, better educated workers. We have the highest paid workers in the world because, you know, we do have highly skilled workers and we need to, and by the way, the other thing you need that really hasn't been talked enough about at this hearing is you need vibrant small businesses. One of your colleagues was saying that 65 to 70% of all jobs do come from businesses with less than 100 employees. So we need to make sure that all the policies are not just oriented towards labor, but also the people, the employers who actually provide the jobs in the first place.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Manning, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Spear, let me just start by agreeing with you on one thing, and that is that the American people do want choice. I believe that was evidenced by the last election. It's just that you and I think, have a different understanding of what kind of choice the American people want. So let me move on. Dr. Shierholtz, in my district, we have seen a surge of jobs growing in advanced manufacturing and other industries that require skilled labor. In the previous Congress, I was proud to support bills to expand and streamline registered apprenticeship programs like the National Apprenticeship Act. I was also proud to secure funding for North Carolina A&T State University to implement educational and training opportunities for people who are not full-time college students but want to secure education and training in the STEM fields so they can fill some of the good-paying manufacturing jobs out there. What additional steps do you believe we should be taking to expand access to skilled training and apprenticeship programs?
So I think I'm not a workforce expert, but I will say that things like making sure that we have good access to union apprenticeships, pre-apprenticeship programs, which really help with diversity. It is a way to get like women, people of color into the pipeline. Making sure that there's good pathways to good jobs following the apprenticeship. And then can I say just one other thing? When I think about increasing labor force participation, it's not just about skills, it's also about making people who have care responsibilities have them taking, like, an ability to take care of them so that they can work. So things like childcare, paid leave, paternity leave, maternity leave are also just a crucial, like, stool, like, what is it called? Leg of that stool to increase our labor force participation.
So those wraparound services are things that make it possible for people to work. And is it true that we saw more women fail to come back into the workforce during the pandemic and at the end of the pandemic, and do you attribute it to those kinds of factors?
Yeah, you know what, I'm not sure exactly where it is right now, but we definitely saw that at least at one point of the pandemic where you saw women's labor force participation drop more. Basically, labor force participation now is essentially back to where it was pre-pandemic, but it really kept people out during that period, and those with care responsibilities were the ones that were hardest hit, and as we know, that tends to fall on women.
So no matter where I go in my district, from hospitals to schools to farms to restaurants, I have employers tell me they simply cannot find enough workers to hire. Do you believe the lack of pathways to legal immigration and the virtual shutting down of immigration by the prior administration has had a negative impact on our workforce?
It definitely has. You can just see the numbers that, and I think I agree with Mr. Moore here, who also said that, like, in order to increase our labor force, one of the things that we really need is immigration. Like, that's a core part of meeting U.S. workforce needs.
Thank you. Let me ask you about another area, and that is the mental health crisis that millions of Americans are facing in today's environment. The demand for mental health services has steadily increased due to the awareness of COVID-19 pandemic, the opioid crisis. We've had all kinds of factors attributing to mental health crises, and of course we're seeing particularly with young people, the impact of social media. According to the Health Resources and Services Administration, our national shortage of psychiatrists, psychologists, and addiction counselors will be extremely exacerbated by 2035. Can you describe what the economic effects would be if workers couldn't access the mental health services they need, and what can we be doing to attract more people to go into these critical fields?
That's a fine question, and I'll just say that we need to make sure that all kinds of healthcare, mental health services, other kinds of healthcare that make it possible for people to work, that is there. And so it's just absolutely important that we invest in those things. I think of the decline in state and local government jobs around this, where we know that, you know, a lot of that is teachers, but a lot of that is people who provide other services, including things like mental health services. We need to make sure that the pay for those jobs is good enough that it's really attracting people in.
Thank you so much. My time is about to expire. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kiley, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Dr. Shierholtz, you were the chief economist for the Labor Department during the Obama administration. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you are a supporter of the PRO Act. You testified today that it is a crucial reform. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you also testified that anyone who is a bona fide independent contractor will not be affected by the PRO Act. Was that your testimony?
That's right.
So as you're aware, the legal standard for independent contracting that is part of the PRO Act has already been implemented in California under state law, the law known as AB 5. It contains the same ABC test. So in reaching your conclusion that anyone who is a bona fide independent contractor will not be affected by the PRO Act, did you speak with the independent contractors who have been affected by AB 5 in California?
I did not, but I can look at what the the ABC test actually does. It's a 3-pronged test that
I
a bona fide contractor really would fit under.
I understand, but my question was whether you spoke with anyone who was affected by AB 5 in California as an independent contractor, and your answer was no. Is that right?
That's true.
So I have spoken with many of these folks. I'm from California. And as a matter of fact, shortly after that law went into effect, we compiled a whole book of their stories about how they have been affected by this law. AB 5 stories, testimonials of Californians who have lost their livelihoods. And this was just in a few days after the law went into effect. You could fill many more volumes by this point. And so since you didn't have the opportunity to speak with those who have been affected in reaching your conclusion that those who are bona fide independent contractors will not be affected by the PRO Act, I thought maybe I'd share with you a few of their stories. For example, here is testimony from Colleen. Colleen says, I am a court reporter in California that does depositions. I do work for many different firms. 2 firms have already notified me that they can no longer give me work. I am the one who supports my family, and I have been doing this work for over 30 years. I'm not sure what to do now. Dr. Shierholtz, does the testimony of Colleen in any way change your conclusion that anyone who is a bona fide independent contractor will not be affected by the PRO Act?
It does not, because one of the things that's core is, does Colleen want to organize? Because that's what will be affected under the PRO Act. What it does is it means that people who are misclassified as independent contractors, so who are not independent contractors, will, the only way it affects them is if they actually want to organize. That's the thing. So if there's people if Colleen wanted to organize, then I could say maybe that would be an impact.
Okay, so here's another person, Esther. She says, I help people who don't speak English communicate with medical providers. I'm a proud senior, independent, and self-sufficient. AB 5 leaves me out of work, unprotected, and isolated. It takes away my pride. It was passed without taking people like me into account. Does the testimony of Esther affect your conclusion that anyone who is a bona fide independent contractor will not be affected by the PRO Act?
Not by the PRO Act.
This is from Jody. I worked years to gain my skill as an American Sign Language interpreter. It was my goal since I was 9 years old. After AB 5, I lost all 3 of my agencies. The dream I worked for is lost. I can't provide for my family, and thousands of California deaf won't be serviced. Does the testimony of Jody affect your conclusion that anyone who is a bona fide independent contractor will not be affected?
I have not heard anything that made that what is going on in the PRO Act is going to affect those folks.
The PRO Act contains the same ABC test as AB 5, does it not?
Yes, but it doesn't affect like wage and hour, like it only affects your status vis-a-vis the NLRA.
This is from John. I am a guest orchestral conductor. Because of this bill, I just lost my first scheduled job with an orchestra. $9,000 that would have been a dent in my student loans or helped pay my insurance or paid for food and shelter is now gone, all because of AB 5. Are you still sure that adopting this legal standard for independent contracting on a nationwide basis, either through the PRO Act or the Department of Labor's proposed rule, is not going to affect any bona fide independent contractor?
Again, the PRO Act is the Department of Labor's rule, the proposed rule that they just put out, does not implement the ABC rule. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the PRO Act, which does implement the ABC rule only for the NLRA, and none of the examples that you have given me have had anything to do with
Mr. Spear,
labor law.
You've testified as the head of the American Trucking Association about the potential losses of livelihoods from the PRO Act. What were the numbers that you gave?
Well, just on ICs alone, you've got 350,000 drivers operating under that model nationwide, 70,000 in California alone. We're right now short 78,000 drivers. So if you want to continue inflation at 40-year highs, start getting rid of more of our drivers. Guarantee you're going to pay double, if not triple, what you're paying at the shelf right now.
And so despite whatever limitations Dr. Shierholtz just tried to tell us, you think that these impacts would be felt as a result of the
you've got a live rulemaking over the Department of Labor right now that deals with this, so it's not just the PRO Act. This is an all-out assault on a 90-year-old case law-supported business model. Why is that? Why is that? It's because union rates have dropped to half of what they were in 1983. They're struggling for membership. They're struggling for dues. So what better way to change that than change the laws, change the rules so you can channel more people into unions? I don't care if you're a union member or not. You should have the right to belong or not belong. But that doesn't, just because you're struggling to organize doesn't mean you get to change the rules in your favor. These laws have been around for 90 years. NLRA was passed in 35, FLSA 38, relatively unchanged. Why? Because they maintain the balance between employers and employees. This is a concerted effort to change that. And the only reason I can see doing so is to up membership and dues. That's it.
Thank you.
Mr. Spear, Mr. Kiley, I'm hoping to get this hearing done before 1:30 and the votes are coming. So I'm going to ask people to please stay within their time. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm really appreciative of the committee's focus on workforce development. But I have to say, I'm disappointed that many of my colleagues seem to be decoupling workforce development from workforce protections. And I really see finding solutions to grow the workforce and implementing fair labor standards should not be mutually exclusive. And I think that those fair labor standards, fair wages, safe working conditions, the right to organize, those should be part of workforce development. You know, last Congress, we passed the Infrastructure and Investment in Jobs Act and the CHIPS and Science Act, both on a bipartisan basis. We continue our commitment to American workers by creating pathways to good paying family jobs. The Inflation Reduction Act, for example, lots of jobs there. We also advanced the bipartisan National Apprenticeship Act reauthorization in the House, and committee Democrats also advanced a comprehensive reauthorization of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. So I just want to note quickly, we've had a lot of conversations about apprenticeships, and I know Dr. Shierholtz, you mentioned pre-apprenticeships. Those are really critical too, and conversations I've had with pre-apprentices, huge deal. Mr. Speer, you correctly described the important role that truck drivers fill in our economy by delivering critical goods relied on by families in my state of Oregon and around the country, so thank you for keeping our economy moving forward. And I'm also glad to see in your testimony you were recognized as you have a registered apprenticeship program sponsor. Registered apprenticeships are good for workers and employers because of the high quality training standards and strong protections, but also provide a return on investment. So your testimony mentioned there were delays in the registration process. Well, the Bipartisan National Apprenticeship Act helps streamline that registration process. It actually requires that the Department of Labor give provisional approval within a month and final approval within a year. Would that be helpful in access to registered apprenticeships? Would it help fill the truck driver shortage?
Yeah, it's instrumental. It's one of the things that we've promoted and advocated for several years throughout the Trump administration, Biden administration. Finally got it done. Got it done. And by the way, it's apprenticeship programs. They're union apprenticeship programs and they're non-union apprenticeship programs.
I appreciate that, and I want to ask a question of Mr. Akers. I just want to make sure that that provision was going to be helpful.
Absolutely.
Mr. Akers, in my former life, I was a practicing lawyer and I represented franchisees. So I very much appreciate the franchise model. Had a lot of clients who were franchisees. So your testimony claims that this PRO-ACT's joint employer standard and the standard that the NLRB is considering reinstating would undermine the franchise relationship. But in reality, the joint employer standard was around for years before. It holds companies accountable only if they control the employment relationship of another employer's workers, the wages, the hours, the working conditions. So I'd like to ask you a few questions. These are yes and no questions. Does your franchisor control the hiring and firing of your employees?
No.
And does your franchisor set your employees' wages?
No.
And does your franchisor set your employees' schedules?
No.
Okay, so Mr. Akers, to the best of my knowledge, the NLRB has never issued a decision finding a franchisor to be a joint employer of its franchisees' employees, because that's not the kind of relationship. And in fact, if your franchisor does not control your employees' working conditions, does not control those issues, the wages, the schedules, then the joint employer standard doesn't affect you or other franchisees. In fact, a strong joint employer standard actually protects you because it makes it more likely that franchisors won't try to control your practices and your employment practices. And if they do, they'll be on the hook for liability. So that's why the American Association of Franchisees and Dealers, which is a franchisee organization, supports the PRO-ACT's joint employer standard and supports the current rulemaking that would restore the Browning-Ferris decision. So, Madam Chair, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record letters from the American Association of Franchisees and Dealers into the record.
Without objection.
Terrific. And I just want to reiterate the importance of these workforce protections, the right to organize, the right for fair wages, the right for safe working conditions. And we've had a conversation today. One of my colleagues talked about how wages haven't kept up with costs. We need to raise the minimum wage. $7.25 is our national minimum wage, and that's unacceptable. So that's something we should be talking about as well. I hope we can work together, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Scott, on bipartisan solutions like we did with the National Apprenticeship Act. I hope we can get that over the finish line in the House and the Senate, because it's really going to make a difference, not only to the people who go through the apprenticeships, but also to their families. And set a good example, getting people back to work. So with that, Madam Chair, I will submit the letters and yield back the balance of my time.
Goes back. Mr. Good, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Fox. Thank you to all of our witnesses here today. And my questions will be primarily directed to Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, I think perhaps the most underappreciated in terms of its harm of all Democrat legislation in the last Congress was the PRO Act, what it would do to just destroy the gig economy, subcontractors, independent contractors, eliminate secret ballots, eliminate right to work, force the payment of union dues through payroll deduction, and so much more. At 10% for all sectors on average, the nation's union membership is declining, thankfully. It's at its lowest level ever, thankfully. But that is skewed because it's 33% for public sector employees, and it's about 6% for private sector. And I would submit that public sector union membership should be illegal. It's contrary to the interests of the taxpayer, the country, and the citizens that we are supposed to serve, and not to mention the fact that public sector employees have highly desirable salaries, benefits, retirement programs, and job security compared to the private sector. Our president promised to be the most pro-union president in history. He kept that promise along with his promise to eliminate reliable energy, his promise to open the border, not to mention the bonus of the unprecedented spending. And the administration is trying to follow through with trying to take action through NLRB and the Department of Labor to implement provisions of the PRO Act because it hasn't been able to successfully become law, thankfully. What do you think is the impact of these pro-union policies, the administration putting their thumb on the scale, trying to force union membership increase in the private sector? What do you think what are your concerns on that impact, primarily on businesses and employers?
Congressman, I agree with everything that you just said, that the real problem is public sector unionism. And the problem is you don't have anybody protecting the taxpayer interest, in the negotiations of the contract. And that's why, most public employees, with respect to, how they compare with their private sector counterparts, depending on the state or whether it's federal, get, 20% bonus in terms of salaries and much, much higher benefits. And that's not fair to the people who are paying for their salaries. I just want to make it very clear. I don't think anybody in this room is against unions. Are you against unions?
I am against unions, yes, sir.
Okay, well,
I worked in a union shop in college.
I believe in the First Amendment, that people have a right of association. A union is just association.
I'm not against the right to unionize, but I think it's a terrible decision when you do.
But my point is, look, I'm very much, if people want to form a union, if 6 people want to get together and collectively bargain, that's your right as an American. I'm outraged by the idea that anyone in America should be forced to join a union.
That's right.
Yeah, why? Why should someone be forced to join a union if they don't want to? Pro-choice. So, and just one last point about this. The evidence is crystal clear, undeniable. We have half the states in the United States are right-to-work states, and half of the states are forced union states. Guess where all the jobs are going? Twice as many jobs are being created in the states that have right-to-work laws. When I worked at the Wall Street Journal, as I was saying earlier, we talked to major employers all the time. And they said, you know what? If a state is a forced union state, we don't even think about putting a factory there and so on. The tragedy, unfortunately, what happened to Michigan just a week ago, which had been a right-to-work state and has now turned into a forced union state, and that's going to really hurt the great state of Michigan.
Yeah, businesses and citizens are voting with their feet and fleeing these terrible Democrat-run blue states and these pro-union states and going to right-to-work states, as you said. I would submit that unions have far outlived their usefulness, and this us-against-them mentality is just a terrible thing in the workplace. And again, I experienced that as a college kid working in an auto factory. I want to switch gears for a moment and talk about the labor participation rate. The Biden administration likes to talk about low unemployment. We've got an estimated 7 million able-bodied men ages 25 to 54 not in the workplace, 11 million open jobs, lowest historical labor participation rate. How have the elimination of work requirements and enhanced unemployment, all of that, what are your thoughts on the policies that have caused the low labor participation rate over the last couple of years in particular?
So I'm so glad you asked that, because there's been some misinformation here about the work requirements that were put in place in 1996, which I said are the greatest social policy achievement we've made in 50 years. So I'm just going to really just quickly rattle off the 4 effects of that after 8 years, okay? And then you can decide whether you think it was a success or not. And these are based on, scientific studies. 1, welfare caseloads were reduced by 60%. 60% after welfare reform and work requirements were put in effect. 2, 60 to 70% of those who left welfare went into jobs.
How about that?
They went into jobs. They got a paycheck. Third, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, says that those reforms saved taxpayers and the federal government $50 billion.
Wow.
In today's dollars, that would be a saving of $100 billion. And fourth, and maybe most importantly, child poverty fell every year.
Wow.
Child poverty fell every year after we passed welfare reform. Somebody tell me how
Case
that's
is
not
clear.
a
I'm past
resounding
my
success.
time. Thank you, Mr. Moore. You're exactly right. Thanks for sharing that. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ms. McBath, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox and Ranking Member Scott and your staff and all of you that are giving testimony for us today. And I'd like to say to my Republican colleagues, if you truly want to unleash America's opportunities for hiring and employment, the solution is not to villainize and victimize our unions and our working people, because oftentimes, their only real voice is in the workplace. The real solution to this problem is empowering and investing in our workers and our workforce development system. And I look forward to doing that very thing with my Republican colleagues at the earliest point that we're able to find that we have an opportunity to do so. However, the solutions that are being touted by Republicans today will do nothing more than to solve the major issues that are facing our employers. They'll do nothing to reverse the decades-long trend of declining public investment in our workforce development programs and initiatives across the country. Instead, they will only do more to tip the scale even further against working families and everyday Americans who are punching the clock just to get by. And since it was signed into law in 2014, the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, or WIOA, has assisted millions of Americans, workers in learning more about obtaining the skills and training required to succeed in today's economy. While this was an important bipartisan step in the right direction, WIOA has unfortunately never been fully funded and able to live up to its full potential to serve the American public. In fact, the federal government spends significantly far less today on workforce development programs than it did over 20 years ago in 2001. So it's vitally important that we reauthorize WIOA and ensure that this program gets the secured funding necessary to fulfill its intended purpose. And my bill, the Train for a Better America Act, which was included in the WIOA Act of 2022 that passed the House last Congress, would assist community colleges and technical training schools in connecting recent and upcoming graduates with local employers in high-demand fields by codifying the Department of Labor's Strengthening Community Colleges Training Grant Program. It would take real, tangible steps to fix our workforce pipeline and make it easier on companies that are looking for talent and on workers that are seeking to better themselves through hard work and education. So instead of playing politics and sending messaging bills to die with the Senate, we can expand upon these programs and efforts like this. Programs that are already on the ground and proven to help fill the very real workforce shortages in areas like construction, which we're talking about today, and nursing that we all hear about when we meet our constituents back in our districts. I talk to people in my district all the time that talk about all of the really difficult ways that they're being able to find work, or when they take the time away from their families to fly up here and to sit in these hearings and to tell us the same stories. So, Mr. Spear, as I mentioned in my remarks, we've seen a declining investment in our country's workforce programs for decades. Because of these funding shortfalls, many local workforce boards are forced to cap the funding mechanisms that they use to train workers, and this is also the ITAs. So should Congress expand funding the ITAs to help cover the full cost of these training programs?
I think there's a role to play as you consider reauthorization to really have better alignment and cohesion between the federal, state, and the local workforce boards to identifying those pockets of need, where those dollars are going. They're valuable dollars, and they need to be going to employment sectors that are going to not only support that local economy, but state and national economy. So I think the alignment and cohesion between federal, state, and local boards is absolutely essential. Channeling that money as wisely as you can down and making certain it gets to people that not only get a job, but a job that's going to contribute to the economy going forward is really, in my view, the essence of WIOA.
And so the ITAs are only worth about $2,000. Is that sufficient? Is that enough money to enhance training for workforce development?
We have everything that could cover. A lot of our training does take more than just that amount. I do think we have a lot of employers that want to support covering the costs of employees that get their CDL, get that training. I think there is prioritization at the workforce boards of truck drivers, for instance. The skills they're going to need, designating them as essential, skilled, in demand, and reimbursing them for the costs that it takes to get those CDLs. Those costs have gone up, and I think the bill needs to reflect that.
Thank you. My time is up. I yield back the balance.
Thank you, Mr. Smucker. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to hear from each of our witnesses today regarding the opportunities that we have to unleash our workforce and get our economy back on track. 2 years into the Biden administration, we're still facing significant problems encouraging American workers to return to work. And in fact, as some of our witnesses have pointed out, there are roughly 10 million open jobs in our country today and only about 5 million people who are looking for employment. We heard earlier from one of our witnesses that our labor force participation rate seems to have reached its highest, seems to be higher than the highest participation rate just prior to the pandemic. And that same idea was presented by Secretary Yellen at a Ways and Means Committee hearing. But this chart shows otherwise. And this chart is labor force participation rate prior to the pandemic. You'll see the high. Top is women and men. It shows that in both cases, we have not achieved the labor force participation rate that we'd seen prior to the pandemic. And this, by the way, is millions of workers who haven't returned to work. We really need more people entering the workforce rather than leaving. And I do believe there are multiple reasons for this, but one of the reasons is the Democrat policies that are disincentivizing work. In fact, as we heard in Mr. Moore's testimony, if you add up normal unemployment benefits, health insurance benefits, unemployed individuals in the state that I represent, Pennsylvania, would receive a benefit of equal to an earned income of $82,888. Now tell me how that encourages work. You can make a great living just by staying home, apparently. And as I travel around my district, and I've heard from all of you here, workforce shortages are the #1 issue that I hear about from small business owners, followed by inflation and also supply chain issues. During the pandemic, Democrats enacted policies in the bloated American Rescue Plan, which paid workers more to stay home than to return to their jobs. In Pennsylvania, that was about 42%, literally could make more staying at home than returning to their jobs. And I don't fault anyone for making that decision. I've often said it was a deeply unfair position for the federal government to put families in, to tell workers that to stay home is a better way to provide for their families. And I was encouraged by some of the comments from my Democrat colleagues talking about we all understand the need to return people to work. We understand the best way out of poverty is to provide an individual, help an individual connect with a great paying job. And there's an inherent dignity in that work, and it provides that first rung in that upward ladder of mobility. The current workforce shortages that we're facing, as I said, are directly tied to Democrats' failed pandemic-era policies that closed our businesses, closed our schools, and shuttered our economy. All of our witnesses have agreed that skills development is a necessary component of our economic recovery. And I believe that we should enact policies that put job creators and businesses in the driver's seat, because local businesses know best what kind of workers and qualifications they need to fill those open positions. I want to just mention a bill I recently reintroduced, the USA Workforce Tax Credits Act, which would create a new tax credit for charitable donations to community-based apprenticeship initiatives, career and technical education, and workforce development programs. This legislation is modeled, it's similar to a K-12 EITC program in Pennsylvania that works very, very effectively. It creates strong partnerships between local businesses, and in this case, K-12 programs, and leads to direct benefits for our communities. And for far too long at the federal level, we've focused all of our dollars only to those individuals who are attending college. We've encouraged everyone to do that. We need to rebalance that. This would be a way of doing that while utilizing those partnerships between businesses and those who provide those services. Also want to mention, proud to co-sponsor the Pell Act legislation, which would expand Pell Grant eligibility to high-quality, short-term educational credentialing opportunities. I think there's bipartisan support for that. These two pieces of legislation will expand opportunities for Americans to get training so they can start in-demand careers with family-sustaining wages, grow our economic output and our GDP. And I think I'm already out of time. I was looking forward to get to some questions, but I took all of my time. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Smucker. Mr. Moran, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Akers, I want to address you for a few minutes and ask some questions, but before I do, I just want to thank you for being here on behalf of the International Franchise Association. I also was a franchise business owner before I came to Congress, and was privileged to be in the staffing company business and understand a lot of what's being said today firsthand, and have a lot of great concerns about what I see in the PRO Act and what I see with the proposed NLRB rule for joint employers. It gives me great concern, and it did before I came to Congress. As a small business owner, what I found out pretty quickly was if I had good control on the local level, and if my business was able to do better, I had better opportunity, more opportunity to do better for my employees. And in fact, that's what we did, whether it was through rent assistance or clothing or pay advances, or frankly, even purchasing automobiles for people so they could have reliable transportation. As the employer of record, I wanted to do that for my employees because I could build into them. And then that created a partnership between my employees and me, and it created longevity in that relationship. And I didn't need the government to tell me what a minimum wage should be, because frankly, the market set that. I wanted to pay folks enough so that they could stay, and they would stay and be loyal to me and provide a great service to our community. And as a result, we would place hundreds of people in work daily in multiple states, and I was proud to be able to do that. So I want to go back to you and talk to you about your statement in your written statement that says franchising is perhaps the most important business growth strategy in American history. Tell us a little bit about what you've seen firsthand, about what that franchise business model allows you to do for your employees and for your clients.
Oh, great question. Thank you for that. We love our employees. Our employees are part of our family. We take care of them like they're family members. My wife's title on her business card is Chief Hugs Officer. And every month she goes around to all the salons and talks to the staff. So we pay above normal wages. I've got stylists that barely graduated high school that are making $65,000 to $80,000 a year, plus a full slate of benefits, including 401k, which I contribute to. And recently we went out and bought a daycare so we could subsidize daycare for our single moms and so on. So we really believe we give them the best we possibly can. We do lend money, do payroll lending. We allow them to buy products that they can pay over a period of time for, tools and things like that. We have loaned literally hundreds of thousands of dollars to our staff for those short-term issues with rent and things like that. I mean, it really is a big family where we're helping each other out. And when you put more regulation on that, as I mentioned before, that money's got to come from somewhere. Truthfully, the same thing happened with Obamacare, because we were giving amazing care to our staff, and we had to take, we didn't take it back, but we were forced into a pigeonhole with what was offered that didn't meet what we were already doing, but by law we were regulated to do it.
So if we take away this franchise business model, who is it that's going to be harmed the most, and who is it that benefits? Because I think that informs really the behind-the-scenes motivation for this push.
Well, you're going to stifle the growth of business. Why would people buy a franchise when they're going to be under that kind of regulation? But mainly, you're going to hurt employees, because we create jobs. We've created hundreds of jobs in the last few years by opening new locations and so on, and there is really no incentive to do that once you put this in place. I was a proud union member when I was very young for about 6 months, and I discovered I could go down the road and get the same job for the same money or more money. And frankly, right now, there are jobs available on every corner in Iowa and Nebraska. So if somebody wants a better paying job, even if they're not skilled in that area, they can go down the road. Our staff stays with us long term because they can't find what we offer anywhere else.
And Dr. Shierholtz earlier said, and I wrote this quote down, we need to, quote, get more minorities into the pipeline of owning businesses. Do you think that the franchise business model provides those opportunities for minorities, for women, for veterans to start a business and to begin a business and to grow a business?
The percentages are clear. IFA did a study a couple of years ago, Oxford Economics. The percentages are much higher. I think it's 25% owned by people of color as opposed to 19% in the normal world we would look at in business. Profitability is higher, revenue is higher, and it allows people who couldn't go out and open their own business a pathway to do that, which is why there's a much larger percentage of the underserved population going into the business world.
Well, Mr. Akers, I certainly appreciate what you've done for your employees, for your clients, and your testimony here today. I completely agree with you. I think this business model is imperative to allowing folks an easier way into owning their own business down the line.
And if I could tag on that, this FTC franchise rule is the #1 way you protect business owners when they're looking at becoming a franchisee. That you know what the revenue is, you know what the profits are because of the guidelines that are covered under the FTC franchise rule. So as an entrepreneur, I can make a logical decision about buying a business or going to another one.
Thank you, Mr. Akers. I yield.
Thank you very much. Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A lot has been said about the PRO Act and how it how it undermines the right to work law. The PRO Act does not require you to join a union. It does require you to pay your fair share of the expenses generated by things you benefit from when the union hires lawyers and accountants and you get a higher pay, or if you get individual representation because they provide individual representation to union members. Those costs cost money, and the PRO Act just requires you to pay your fair share of those expenses, not the cost of the holiday party or the union cookout in the summer or voter registration activities, those things that you're actually benefiting from, but you're not required to join the union. Ms. Shierholtz, on independent contractor, we've heard a lot. If you're misclassified as an independent contractor rather than an employee, do you lose your right to minimum wage and overtime?
Yes, you do.
Do you lose your right to unemployment insurance if you lose your job?
Yes, you do.
And workers' comp if you get hurt on the job?
You lose that too.
So who is actually choosing to classify people as independent contractors?
It's good.
We hear that it sounds like the employees are want to be independent contractors. Is that the case?
What we see is that workers, when they are misclassified as independent contractors, lose thousands every year, like truckers. We did an analysis, I can put it in the record, that truckers lose $11,000 to $18,000 a year when they're misclassified as independent contractors. It is not a model that works for workers. We don't have any workers on this panel. If we ask the workers, we know what they know that they lose. And then the other thing that I just wanted to make sure to correct, because there was some mistakes talked about it. There was a comment that the joint employer rule, that the NLRB joint employer rule would cost franchisors $33 billion. That was an IFA study that was terribly designed. It had a sample size of 54, and they were all IFA members. So we did a really rigorous analysis showing that the NLRB joint employer rule would raise wages for workers by $1 billion.
Thank you. We've heard social supports, people don't work because of they're getting social support. Was there a study done about the impact of some states eliminating the $600 plus up for unemployment compensation and other states not doing it? What was the result?
Yeah, that's one of the things. If it were true that pandemic unemployment insurance benefits really were keeping people out of the labor force en masse, then you should have seen a flooding back into the labor force once those things expired, and that did not happen. If you look at time series of what happened with the labor force when pandemic unemployment insurance expired, you can't see a blip. It just does not show up. It was not the thing that was keeping people out of the labor force. It was the pandemic.
Is there any evidence that raising the minimum wage gradually costs jobs?
What we know from the vast evidence in labor economics of what the economic impacts of increasing the minimum wage is that they raise wages, they reduce inequality, and they do not cause substantial job loss.
Now, we've heard a lot of disparaging comments about today's economy. I just refer people to the chart behind me. The pre-pandemic economy versus the post-pandemic economy. Can you make any comments? And I would also point out that President Biden produced over almost 500,000 jobs a month during a pandemic when President Trump was losing record number of jobs during the pandemic. And he did it, President Biden did it while he was lowering the deficit. Can you make any comments about the relative economy?
Yeah, one of the things that we've heard is that the economy going at the end of the Trump administration was really strong. That's actually true, but it wasn't because of Trump policies. Trump inherited an unemployment rate that was steadily going down, an employment rate that was steadily going up. If you look at those time series, you can't see where Trump took office. Nobody gets to take credit for just sustaining an existing trend. And then what we do know is that the Biden administration with the American Recovery Plan absolutely drove the incredibly strong jobs recovery that we have.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott. Mr. Spear, with nearly 11 million unfilled jobs in the United States, many critical industries are facing a significant shortage of skilled workers. Yet only a third of individuals in a WIOA program are participating in skills development activities, with some local workforce boards spending less than 20% of their funding on reskilling workers. Do you agree that WIOA must place a greater emphasis on skills development if we're going to address our nation's worker shortage?
I do, Madam Chair. I'm very fond of this law. I actually worked on it back in 1998 when it was called WIA, Workforce Investment Act, and it's an evolution. This is a law that needs to reflect the latest trends in your workforce. Just keeping up on innovation is tough enough for Congress. It's happening so fast. We didn't predict that we'd have a global pandemic, and it caused a lot of shifts in our workforce and how our business model in trucking, for that matter, and how we serve people that order everything now from home, and they want it in less than 2 days. So these shifts are really recent. So updating this law and empowering those local workforce boards to really focus on the segments of the workforce that got us through the pandemic, that matter most, that pay well, with benefits. We're not paying minimum wage in trucking. We're paying nearly 70 grand plus benefits. And we're talking paid holidays, paid leave, lodging, meals and incidents, life insurance, health insurance, and retirement plans. This is a good occupation.
Thank you, Mr. Spear. Mr. Akers, very quickly, because I'm running out of time, very quickly. Our economy needs small business owners like yourself, and many of you are franchisees. Give me two of the most significant workforce challenges you face as a franchise owner. Just name them.
Two, staffing, number one. Number two is regulations that we're already putting in place ways to deal with.
Great. Thank you very much. Mr. Moore, just now my colleague from Virginia has talked about pre-pandemic and post-pandemic job numbers. By the chart, they've compared the jobs record of the Trump and Biden administration at the beginning of the hearing and now again. What are your thoughts about their characteristics of the Biden and Trump administrations in terms of the job record?
I'm looking at the chart. You know, the problem, of course, is we lost, I don't even know how many jobs did we lose during the pandemic. I mean, it was in the millions of jobs. So, you know, obviously that changed everything. Trump had a very, very positive jobs record until COVID hit. So I guess that's my attitude. Look, I do think that if you look at what happened there were two factors that really affected employment. One was obviously the shutting down of the economy, and the blue states remained closed much longer than the red states did. And the other factor is the supplemental unemployment benefits and other benefits. There were 5 or 6 additional, you know, if you look at my testimony, you'll see during that period, people could make well over $100,000 in all the benefits that we're providing for people not to work. One piece of evidence that it really mattered was that when red states got rid of the supplemental benefits faster than blue states did, their unemployment rates went down and the blue states' benefits stayed high.
Thank you very much. I also want to point out that in your testimony, you talked about there being dignity in work. I could not agree more. I believe that work is inherently dignifying. However, too many Americans were encouraged to stay out of the workforce following the pandemic. And I think it's important that we now encourage people again to get back into the workforce, because the long-term benefits of work, as you pointed out, with the welfare reforms that were made in the under the Clinton administration, 1996, I think it changed people's lives for the better. I yield back my time. I want to thank our witnesses again for taking the time to testify before the committee today. It's been a very, very energetic set of testimonies and questions. Without objection, there being no further business, the committee stands adjourned.